In 1453, the world changed forever. The walls of Constantinople, thought to be impenetrable for 1,000 years, crumbled before the cannons of Sultan Mehmed II, earning him the title the Conqueror. But the story didn't end at the fall of Byzantium. In the years that followed, Mehmed set his sights on expanding his empire across Europe and Asia, crushing kingdoms in the Balkans, and even launching ambitious campaigns into Italy. This is the story of Mehmed II after Constantinople, a relentless march of ambition, warfare, and empire building that reshaped the map of the 15th century world. Sit back and enjoy, and don't forget to like, comment, and share to grace our work with the favor of the algorithm. Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible. Upon conquering Constantinople after a climactic siege, Sultan Mehmed II had established his realm as one of the foremost powers of its age. With the final fall of the Eastern Roman Empire came an opportunity to rebrand its former seat of power into a new Islamic capital city. However, while the Red Apple was slowly being transformed, further military operations by the Sultan were conducted in the local region against the last pockets of resistance to his rule. The final Byzantine holdouts of Silivri and Epipattos were captured after their local garrisons surrendered upon hearing of the fall of their capital, thus officially marking the end of 1400 years of Roman rule in Thrace. The 2 eastern Roman islands of Lemnos and Imbros had also managed to evade Ottoman occupation during the Great Siege. Regardless, with the shocking fall of Constantinople, the majority of the native Greek-speaking populace of the islands fled in horror to the safety of the Morea Peninsula. With the influential Genoese Getilusio family taking over the islands in their stead, a new peace was established with Mehmed, which saw the Italian noble houses becoming an official Ottoman tributary. Regardless, this peace was to be short, as in 1456, the Ottoman Sultan invaded the domains of the Getilusio in the northern Aegean in order to consolidate his control over the local region. The islands of Imbros, Samothraki, Lemnos, Tenedos and Thassos, and the mainland settlement of Ainos were all swiftly captured in a single military campaign. Only the Getilusio capital island of Lesbos, with its fortress town of Mytilene, was able to repel the Ottoman invasion. Likewise, the Genoese colony of Galata, which had proclaimed neutrality during the Great Siege, had surrendered to Ottoman authorities during the chaotic morning hours of May 29th. The residents of the settlement were guaranteed their lives and property by Zaganos Pasha, who himself had been proclaimed Grand Vizier during the aftermath of Halil Pasha's fall from power. In return for these guarantees, the colony's walls were razed down to the ground, and local Turkic officials confiscated all weaponry and ammunition in the town. With the last vestiges of resistance in the local region defeated, Mehmed II now turned to the reconstruction of the war-ravaged Constantinople, which he wished to turn into his new seat of power. Foremost, the city was cleaned of its rubble from the recent siege, while its land walls and main roads were repaired. Public buildings that had been desolate for centuries were also demolished, such as the Church of the Holy Apostles, the Hippodrome, and the Great Palace Complex. New housing and public buildings were constructed in the abandoned districts of the city, alongside many new mosques. The most famous of the new mosques would be the Fatih Mosque, built between 1463 and 1470, and the Eyüp Sultan Mosque, built in 1458, both constructed to compete with the likeness of the newly converted Hagia Sophia Mosque. The Yedikule fortress was also erected in 1458 at the former Byzantine Golden Gate, as a place for errant Ottoman dignitaries. However, by the late 16th century, it was turned into a prison for foreign envoys. On top of mosques, dozens of bathhouses, public kitchens, schools, and charitable institutions in the form of Vakif foundations were all constructed in the city. During the same period, a new political center in the form of an imperial palace, later dubbed the Old Palace, was also constructed on the former site of the Forum of Theodosius in 1458. It was here that Mehmed would house his royal household and imperial harem. However, wanting to outshine Roman palaces of old, another grander palace was constructed on the first hill of the city, named the Topkapi Palace. It was from this new residence that the Sultan's royal court of governmental officials, later known as the Sublime Porte, was installed alongside the new Enderun School. This latter school for aspiring bureaucrats would cement Mehmed's policy of centralizing the state under a new Devshirme class of elites, thus displacing the well-established Turkoman elites of Anatolia, like the Chandala family, who had produced 4 Grand Viziers to the House of Osman over the last century. In addition to buildings, Christian and Jewish families from all across Anatolia, Thessalonica, and the Morea were settled in the Fener and Balat districts of the deserted capital. This was done to restore Constantinople's commercial output, as many of its former citizens had been driven into slavery after the Great Siege. This settlement of new peoples around the empire was accompanied by the construction of the Grand Bazaar complex, which was finished in 1460, thus creating a brand new economic center for the Ottoman capital. Aside from the reconstruction of Constantinople, the most significant domestic measure taken by Mehmed during this period was the consecration of a new ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. For centuries, holders of this office were seen as the spiritual leaders of the greater Eastern Orthodox world. However, with the fall of the city, the office had been left vacant. In order to gain the loyalty of the Orthodox population of his realm and drive a further political wedge between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, the Ottoman Sultan appointed the strict anti-unionist theologian Gennadius Scholarius as Patriarch in 1454. This was followed up by the establishment of a new Jewish rabbinate and Armenian Patriarchate during the same period, which saw the unofficial creation of the millet system in Ottoman governance. Since religion rather than ethnicity was seen as the primordial marker of national identity within the Ottoman framework of society, prominent religious leaders were now seen as figureheads representing their respective communities throughout the empire. Often these religious leaders were heavily connected to the Sublime Porte through imperial appointments and approvals, which now gave the Sultan a new avenue of control over his non-Muslim minorities throughout the empire. In return for this top-down system of control, these religious communities were often permitted to form independent judicial courts to rule themselves, in which they could practice their local laws and collect their own taxes. All of Sultan Mehmed II's reconstruction efforts and political edicts would be fruitful. By the end of the century, Constantinople's population would soar to over 200,000 from a measly 50,000 in 1453. After many centuries of decline, it seemed like fate once again smiled on New Rome under the leadership of its new Islamic Caesar. By the spring of 1454, Mehmed II was feeling secure in his new capital city, and thus sent emissaries to despot Juraj Branković of Serbia, demanding he relinquish Golubac and Smederevo, or else risk a full invasion from his armies. Fearing another coalition brewing up in the Balkans after his conquest of Constantinople, the Sultan decided to go on the offensive in the region. Although the Serbian Despotate had stayed neutral in the military campaigns of 1453, its status as an impartial buffer state was questioned when Hungarian emissaries threatened war against the Sultan during the last weeks of the Great Siege. According to Ottoman chronicles, a scheming Juraj was also ready to join such a war with Buda's full backing. After 30 days of hearing no response from the Serbian ruler, the Sultan officially declared war and began mustering his armies in Sofia and Plovdiv for the campaign to come. Only a year after the fall of Constantinople, war had now come to Serbia. By the summer of 1454, Mehmed invaded Serbia at the head of a 50,000-strong force, which was divided into 2 columns, one approaching Ostrovica and the other Smederevo. During the gruesome march, thousands of local peoples were carried off into slavery, while Ottoman Akinci cavalry pillaged the countryside of all loot and supplies. In the chaos, despot Juraj fled to Hungary in horror, while reinforcements under the leadership of John Hunyadi slowly began crossing the Danube. Nevertheless, these forces were to be too distant to help. After weeks of being pounded by cannons, Ostrowica fell to Ottoman forces, thus giving the Sultan access to the prosperous mining settlements of the local region. However, the siege on Smederevo was to be less successful, as its garrison put up fierce resistance. Feeling content with the many spoils he had acquired during the campaign, Mehmed discontinued the siege on the Serbian capital and left for Sofia. As the Ottoman army retreated back to friendly territory, a force of 32,000 under Firuz Bey was left behind to resist the Serbians until the next campaigning season. In spite of the heavy losses back during the summer, local Serbian resistance, in the form of guerrilla warfare, persisted into the fall under the general command of Nikola Skulbejic, culminating in a surprising victory against the Ottomans at the Battle of Leskovac. By October, John Hunyadi's forces had also converged against Firuz Bey at the town of Kruševac, inflicting a defeat on the Ottoman general and even capturing him during the chaotic retreat. After the battle, the revenge-seeking Serbian-Hungarian armies marched into Ottoman territory, looting Nis and Pirot and burning down Vidin. Nonetheless, an Ottoman counterattack near Novo Brdo caught a Serbian army led by Skabalic off guard, resulting in the destruction of the Christian army and the execution of its general. The military campaigns of 1454 had been a bloody stalemate for both Serbia and the Ottomans. Wanting to subdue the Serbian threat once and for all, Mehmed launched a new campaign into the region in 1455. Assembling his grand host in Edirne, the Sultan marched on Novo Brdo in spring. After 40 days of immense Ottoman bombardment, the town and its garrison surrendered, along with its famous gold and silver mines. The fall of Novo Brdo was followed by the fall of Pristina, Trepča and Prizren throughout June and July. With the subjugation of southern Serbia complete, the Sultan decided to deal the death blow to Juraj Branković in the following year. Spending the winter of 1455 to 1456 assembling a grand host of 40 to 50,000, Mehmed prepared to march on northern Serbia and, most importantly, the Hungarian fortress city of Belgrade come summer. Seen as a gateway into the Kingdom of Hungary and Central Europe, Belgrade was the most fortified settlement in the Balkans. Being located on the confluence of the rivers Danube and Sevra, the city could only be accessed on land from the south, thus making it a highly formidable target for Mehmed. The Sultan's father, Murad II, had unsuccessfully tried besieging Belgrade back in 1440, but the city's great walls proved too much for his armies. Preparing for this immense challenge ahead, new cannons were cast in Edirne, while a new Danube fleet of 60 vessels was constructed. By the summer of 1456, Mehmed's army was ready and began its march north to the fortress city, bypassing the many towns of northern Serbia. In the months before the Ottoman offensive, Hunyadi had armed Belgrade with 5,000 mercenaries from Poland and Germany, under the command of his brother-in-law Michael Zelegi and his eldest son Ladislaus. However, due to infighting within the Hungarian court between the supporters of Hunyadi and Ladislaus V, preparations for the siege to come were lacking, resulting in the late mobilization of the royal army. As the king fled to Vienna for safety, only the 10,000-strong army of Transylvania and a hastily assembled militia of 30,000 were sent as reinforcements to Belgrade. During this great confusion, the Ottoman army under Mehmed had entered northern Serbia by early June, defeating a Serbian force of 9,000 in a decisive battle near Smederevo. Bypassing the Serbian capital altogether, the first Turkish troops arrived below the walls of the great fortress city on July 4th. The siege of Belgrade had just begun. For over 10 days, the walls of Belgrade were relentlessly bombarded day and night by 100 Turkish cannons, many of which were present at Constantinople 3 years prior. As the walls of the fortress city were being tested, the Ottoman fleet of 60 vessels began blockading the Danube upstream of Belgrade, thus completing the city's full encirclement. Meanwhile, Turkish sappers had also started filling in the moat in front of the mighty fortifications, but were opposed by Hungarian cannon fire from up above. Nonetheless, with food and supplies quickly running out, and the local garrison of the city exhausted from constant bombardment, Belgrade seemed like it was on the brink of capitulation. In spite of the odds, reinforcements in the form of Hunyadi's 40,000-strong hastily assembled army and flotilla appeared from the west of the now ruined city on the 14th of July. In a bloody naval battle lasting over 5 hours, the Hungarians managed to break through the Ottoman blockade, sinking 3 Turkish galleys and their crews to the bottom of the Great River. Another 24 Turkish vessels were captured in the one-sided engagement. The following day, Hunyadi would enter the besieged city with much-needed reinforcements and supplies. In a single move, the Ottomans were now on the back foot. With Hunyadi's militia of 30,000 troops now occupying the bank across the Sava River under the leadership of the Catholic priest John of Capistrano, Mehmed's army was now limited to solely harassing the southern land walls of Belgrade. The next 7 days saw multiple Ottoman assaults on the walls, but the city's rejuvenated local garrison repulsed all attempts. On the 21st of July, a final assault was ordered by the stubborn Sultan, which saw his elite janissaries breaching through the southern land walls and flooding into the city. However, a well-coordinated counter-assault from the inner citadel by Hunyadi himself would lead to a reversal of fortunes for the Turks. During the chaotic retreat, incoming cannon fire also killed the Beylerbey of Rumelia, Deir Karaca Pasha, in a surprising blow to the Ottoman army. To make matters even worse, a more serious problem for Mehmed than the failed assault arose. All the wagons and ropes used to transport his heavy artillery and munitions were also destroyed during an unexpected fire at night, thus rendering all of his deployed arms unmovable. With his siege on Belgrade turning into a disaster, Mehmed was eager to face Hunyadi in a pitched battle, where he knew he could take out the Hungarian magnate once and for all. Ordering the abandonment of a number of tents on his left flank, and ordering his cavalry to feign retreat from the area, the Sultan wished to entice the defenders of Belgrade to lose their discipline and start looting his camp. The experienced Hunyadi understood this feign, and accordingly prohibited his troops from leaving the land walls. In spite of official orders, some in the garrison of the city began to leave their posts in small groups to loot the empty Ottoman camp, and some of their fellow brothers-in-arms soon joined them from the opposite bank of the Sava. Luring the Hungarians into his trap, Mehmed gave the orders to attack, which prompted Hunyadi and his forces on the walls to reluctantly join the grand melee down below. Although the Hungarians had fallen into the Sultan's trap, the feigned Ottoman cavalry that had left earlier in the day was yet to arrive back on the battlefield. As a result of Turkish battle coordination being in a state of disarray, Hunyadi's heavy knights were able to charge into the Turkish infantry, thus capturing many cannons and standards in the process. Seeing that the battle had shifted against him, Mehmed joined the fight himself, killing a number of enemy soldiers, before later being struck in the thigh with an arrow and leaving the battlefield. As all seemed lost for the Ottoman Sultan, his feigned cavalry had returned to camp in the nick of time and managed to stabilize the Hungarian charge until both sides retreated for the night. While the sounds of the wounded echoed below Belgrade, Mehmed and his fellow pashas decided to end the siege. The following 2 days saw the once great Turkish host burying their dead and loading up the wounded in makeshift wagons before retreating down south. Virtually the entire Ottoman camp was left abandoned for the bloodied Hungarians, who began looting in earnest after the Turkish withdrawal. With between 13,000 and 23,000 troops lost in only 3 weeks, the siege of Belgrade was the first military defeat of Mehmed II's reign. Although unable to seize the Hungarian fortress city, fate would once more shine on the Ottomans, as in August, plague struck Hunyadi's army. Only a month after his great victory over Mehmed, the Hungarian magnate, who had been a thorn in Ottoman expansion for over 16 years, would succumb to the now spreading epidemic. In December of the same year, despot Juraj Branković of Serbia would also die at the age of 80, thus leaving his despotate in a state of political turmoil. Juraj's successor was his son Lazar Branković, who formally assumed power in early 1457. Lazar inherited a fragile state. Serbia had been devastated by wars, its economy weakened, and its aristocracy divided in loyalties. The Hungarians, still recovering from their victory at Belgrade, sought to assert greater influence over Serbia, while the Ottomans, undeterred by the setback, were determined to complete their domination of the Balkans. Lazar lacked both the authority and the resources of his father to navigate these pressures. His reign was brief, as he died suddenly in January 1458 after less than a year in power, plunging Serbia into a deep succession crisis. He left no male heir, only daughters, and his widow, Helena Palaiologina, daughter of the Byzantine despot Thomas Palaiologos, took on the role of regent alongside her blind brother-in-law Stefan Branković. Helena faced the impossible task of defending Serbia while navigating the competing interests of the nobility, Hungary, and the Ottomans. Serbian aristocrats split into pro-Hungarian and pro-Ottoman factions. Some nobles believed submission to the Ottomans, through tribute and suzerainty, offered the best chance of survival. Others looked north to Hungary, which still maintained a strong military presence and claimed overlordship over Serbia. At the same time, Helena sought to use marriage alliances to secure Serbia's future. Her daughters became pawns in diplomatic negotiations. A marriage to a Hungarian noble or a Bosnian prince could bring protection, but also risked provoking the Ottomans. The absence of a universally accepted successor only deepened the crisis. The decisive development came in early 1459. Serbia's pro-Hungarian faction pushed for an alliance with the Kingdom of Bosnia, itself under threat from the Ottomans. Helena's daughter, Maria Branković, was married to Stefan Tomašević, son of King Thomas of Bosnia. With Hungarian support, Stefan was proclaimed despot of Serbia in March 1459. This move was intended to strengthen Serbia's ties with Hungary and Bosnia against the Ottoman Empire. Yet in practice it backfired. To Mehmed, Stefan's ascension represented the establishment of an anti-Ottoman bloc in the Central Balkans, one explicitly supported by his enemies. However, within Serbia, not all nobles supported Stefan's rule. Pro-Ottoman magnates, fearing retribution from the Sultan, distanced themselves from the new regime. The leader of this resistance was a certain Michael Angelević, brother to the new Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha. Wanting to use his connections at the Ottoman court to become the new Serbian despot, Michael conducted a coup against Stefan, but was unsuccessful. However, his imprisonment by Serbian authorities would spark war for the despotate the following year. In spring 1459, Mehmed II marched into Serbia with a large Ottoman force and laid siege to Smederevo, the capital fortress on the Danube. Although heavily fortified, the city was isolated and undermined by internal division. The garrison, demoralized and influenced by nobles leaning towards the Ottomans, offered little resistance. Realizing that neither Hungary nor Bosnia would send decisive aid, Stefan Tomašević quickly found himself without options. On June 20, 1459, Smederevo surrendered without a major fight. Mehmed entered the city in triumph, and Serbia was formally annexed into the Ottoman Empire. The Branković dynasty lost its throne, and Stefan returned to Bosnia in shame. The fall of Smederevo marked the end of the Serbian despotate as a sovereign state, and secured Ottoman dominance in the Central Balkans. It gave Turkish armies a direct route towards Bosnia and Hungary, setting the stage for further conquests in the following decades. However, as Serbia fell for the final time, Mehmed now had to contend with the burning flame that was Albania. By the time of Sultan Mehmed II's ascension to the Ottoman throne in 1451, the Albanian revolt, under the leadership of Skanderbeg, had been active for over 7 long years. During this period, the Albanian leader had won countless victories over various Turkish armies, with remarkable feats of resourcefulness and perseverance. However, the recent wars had taken an economic toll on the rebelling regions, as many Albanian towns and pastures were left in a state of ruin, thus causing famine to hit the country by the turn of the decade. By 1450, this high cost for independence had caused some members of the League of Leisure, such as the noble families of Arianiti and Decagini, to break off ties with Skanderbeg and conclude separate peace deals with the Sublime Porte. With his political situation at home deteriorating, Skanderbeg concluded a hasty treaty with King Alfonso V of Aragon and Naples in 1451, thus becoming his vassal in return for urgent aid against the Turks. The Western king himself had greater ambitions to establish a powerful Mediterranean empire, and viewed Albania as his gateway to the Adriatic and the Balkans. With much-needed Western mercenaries, food supplies, and funding pouring into Albania by the end of the year, Skanderbeg now had the means to continue his resistance against Edirne. In addition to foreign aid, he would also attempt to unify the disenchanted Albanian nobility with his marriage to the daughter of George Arianiti, concluding with the House of Arianiti re-entering the League of Leisure. All of these political and military developments couldn't have come any sooner. as an Ottoman provincial army of 30,000, led by Tahip Pasha, invaded Albania in 1452. Mustering his host of 14,000, Skanderbeg surprisingly marched on the invading army, which unexpectedly split in half when entering the famine-ridden region. Not expecting any resistance from the locals, the outnumbered and oblivious detachment of 12,000 men, led by Hamza Pasha, began their siege on the newly built fortress town of Modric, without scouting the local region. Knowing this, Skanderbeg ambushed and routed the Ottoman force beneath the wall of Modric on July 21st, even capturing Hamza Pasha himself. In the following days, the Albanian leader built on his victory with another against Tahip Pasha's now isolated host of 18,000 on the nearby plain of Mechad, this time killing the Turkish general during the heat of battle. Between the two engagements, over 7,000 Ottoman soldiers were slain, and many more were wounded. Although once again faced with defeat in Albania, the Ottoman government under Mehmed II was too preoccupied with preparations to besiege Constantinople to respond effectively against the rebellion. Consequently, in 1453, Skanderbeg chose to invade Ottoman northern Macedonia while the Sultan's armies were distant, mired beneath the formidable Theodosian walls. His goal was to recapture the fortress town of Svetigrad, which he had lost to Sultan Murad back in 1448. Launching his offensive in the spring, the Albanian leader invaded the region and began devastating and looting the local countryside. In a surprising counter near the plain of Polog, Skanderbeg's army was able to defeat and rout a local Turkish provincial host under the command of Ibrahim Pasha, a former friend of the Albanian lord during his time in service under the Ottoman army. In the heat of battle, the former friends turned adversaries fiercely duelled, culminating in Skanderbeg beheading Ibrahim and displaying his head atop a pike. The one-sided Battle of Polog would result in a further 3,000 Ottomans dead. However, in spite of yet another great victory, the Albanian lord's invasion of northern Macedonia would halt with the shocking news of Constantinople's fall the following month. In 1454, after making peace with the hostile northern house of Dukagini, Skanderbeg turned his attention to recapturing the fortress of Berat, which had been lost to a surprise Ottoman assault in 1450. Receiving essential Neapolitan artillerymen for his upcoming campaign, the Lord of Albania advanced on the fortress in 1455 and laid siege to it with his force of 14,000. After several months of being besieged, the demoralized Ottoman garrison of Berat began negotiations to surrender the fortress. Hearing of this great news, an overconfident Skanderbeg split his host and moved down south in order to besiege the Turkish-held town of Vlora, leaving 6,000 men behind under Mesopotamia to finalize the surrender of Berat. However, unbeknownst to him, a 20,000-strong Ottoman army sent by the Sultan himself, under the leadership of Isa Bey, was already headed to relieve Berat from the east. In a costly error, the besieging Albanian army was surrounded and virtually destroyed in an ambush sometime in July. Mesopotamia, thousands of veteran Albanians, and the vast majority of Neapolitan artillery crews were killed in the engagement. The major Albanian defeat at the siege of Berat was to be a massive blow to the Albanian revolt. Shaken by the great disaster, Moisi Arianiti, one of Skanderbeg's most trusted and able officers, had defected to the Ottomans. Mehmed II had promised him a large pension and freedom to rule over all of his hereditary lands in Albania if he helped his armies defeat Skanderbeg. While the Sultan marched on Belgrade in 1456, Moisi marched on Albania at the head of a 15,000-strong Ottoman provincial army. However, like the Sultan at Belgrade, he would be dealt a significant defeat as Skanderbeg met him on the plains of Oranik near the town of Debar. Being wounded during the battle and losing up to 10,000 men, Moisi fled back to the safety of Ottoman territory. Despite his treason and great defeat, Skanderbeg would pardon the disgraced Albanian lord and restore his titles and lands to him by the end of the year. Although Moisi had been defeated, further defections from the League of Leisure occurred in the following months, as the Albanian nobility began to waver in their support for the increasingly despotic Skanderbeg, whom they now viewed as a more significant threat to their estates than the Ottomans. In 1456, George Balchitz defected to the Ottomans by surrendering the fortress of Madritsa to a Turkish garrison, as an act of protest against his uncle's infringement of the rights and territories of his family. Although he was jailed for his treason and sent to Naples, a far more serious and shocking defection came the following year by Hamza Kasriotti, Skanderbeg's nephew, who had been by his side since the start of the rebellion back in 1443. In return for his defection, Mehmed II had promised to make Hamza the governor of Albania. However, according to some sources, the nobleman may also have felt threatened by the birth of Skanderbeg's son the previous year, and so took up arms to claim his self-perceived birthright over the domains of the Kastrioti family. With the Sublime Porte's war in Hungary and Serbia coming to a pause after its defeat in Belgrade in 1456, it now turned its full attention to Albania. By the summer of 1457, Hamza and his retinue had joined an Ottoman provincial army of 50,000 headed straight to Albania, led by the victor of Berat himself, Isa Bey. Feigning retreat to the mountains, Skanderbeg's host of 10,000 gathered together, while Ottoman raiders ravaged the countryside all the way to the Adriatic. It wasn't until the Turkish host was south of Lach in early September that the Albanian lord descended from the forested mountains and ambushed the invader camp in 3 separate directions. In the chaos, over 15,000 Turks were killed and another 15,000 were captured, alongside Hamza himself. Pardoning his nephew and sending him away to Naples, Skanderbeg had once again won a great victory against a numerically superior foe. Unfortunately for the Sublime Porte, the bleeding ulcer that was the Albanian rebellion would now enter into its 15th year with no end in sight. While bloody war raged on in Albania, Sultan Mehmed II also set out to conquer the last Eastern Roman rump states of Morea and Trebizond, and become the undisputed sole Caesar of the Romans. Morea had become the most prosperous province of the Eastern Roman Empire in the decades before the fall of Constantinople. Under the various members of the Palaiologos dynasty, the region had been home to a Roman cultural and economic revival during the 15th century. However, by the 1450s, the two quarrelsome younger brothers of the late Constantine XI, Thomas and Demetrios, both ruled the region as rival co-despots from their respective capitals of Patras and Mithras. This political divide in Morea had, in the months before the Great Siege, resulted in the violent sacking of the region by Ottoman forces, which prevented the ruling brothers from sending reinforcements to the Roman capital. Despite the shocking fall of Constantinople and the recent sacking, the two brothers remained in power under Ottoman vassalage, where they were obliged to pay 10,000 ducats a year to Constantinople. Regardless of their new status under the Sultan, a popular revolt arose in Morea by the end of 1453. The initiators of the revolt were 30,000 Moreot Albanians, led by the nobleman Peter Boer, who felt displeased with the overtaxation policies of Thomas and Demetrios, caused by the need to pay annual tribute to the Turks. Soon, many like-minded Greek-speaking peoples joined the revolt, and they hailed Manuel Kantakouzenos as the new despot of all Morea. Powerless against the revolt, and besieged in their respective capitals, Thomas and Demetrios requested Ottoman intervention in the region to restore order. By 1454, the desperate pleas of the co-despots were answered by Turhan Bey's invasion of Morea, resulting in the crushing of the revolt. Although the brothers continued to rule in the region, by 1457 they were already behind on multiple years of tributary payments to the Sultan. The following year, Mehmed issued an ultimatum to his vassals, stating that they must either pay all their tribute or surrender all their lands to him. Hearing no response from the two brothers, the Sultan personally led his armies into the Morea in spring. Along the journey to the south, the last remnants of the Latin Duchy of Athens were conquered without any resistance. Crossing over the destroyed remains of the once great Hexamilian walls, Turkish troops began besieging the highly fortified Arc of Corinth and captured it after a 4-month bloody struggle. Ottoman victories persisted with the fall of Phlius, Akova, Rupeli, Muchli, Agio, Kalavrita, and even Thomas's capital of Patras during the same period. Defeated militarily, the two despot brothers agreed to a peace with Mehmed, under which he would retain his conquests in Morea in return for a lower annual tribute of 3,000 ducats. Leaving Umar Bey behind as the governor of Ottoman Morea, the Sultan departed for Constantinople with thousands of Greek-speaking Moreans whom he intended to resettle in his new capital. Nonetheless, this new peace in the Morea was to be fleeting, as in 1459, the self-destructive struggle between the two co-despot brothers had shattered any semblance of order in their realms. The more pro-Western and pro-Unionist Thomas had broken ties with the pro-Ottoman and anti-Unionist Demetrios. In February, the desperate despot invaded the lands of his brother and Omar Bey, but failed to take Acrocorinth and his former capital of Patras in twin sieges. During the expedition, only the town of Kalavrita was taken from the Ottomans. More successfully, the fortresses of Karatina, Bodonia, Kastritsa, Kalamai, Zanata, Leuktron, and all of the Mani Peninsula were taken from Demetrios. In addition to Thomas's military campaign, the previously subdued Albanians of Morea under Peter Boer also rose in an opportunistic rebellion against the two brothers, resulting in the mass pillaging of the Greek lands in the south of the region. Back in Constantinople, Mehmed II was finalizing a treaty with the Republic of Ragusa on the Adriatic coast, which saw the maritime domain becoming an official Ottoman vassal state. When the Sultan heard of Thomas's insubordination and the chaos that befell the now blood-soaked Morea, he went into a complete rage and removed Omar Bey from his post and fiefs, replacing him with his son-in-law Ahmed Bey as local governor. By the middle of 1459, Turkish forces once again entered Morea, resulting in Thomas retreating to his new capital of Liontauri, where he was defeated in an open battle beneath the walls of the town. Luckily for the rebelling despot, the local Ottoman army of Ahmed Bey was short on supplies and too hampered with disease to conduct a complete siege on Liontauri, and thus retreated back to friendly territory by the fall of 1459. During the pause in hostilities, Thomas began reconciliation talks with Demetrios in a small church in the village of Kastritsa in an attempt to unify their strength against the Ottomans and marauding Albanians. However, this attempt by the brothers to unify their realms was to be fleeting, as by the spring of 1460, Mehmed's armies once again invaded Morea. In a short siege by Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha, Demetrios' capital of Mistras surrendered on May 29th, exactly 7 years to the day of Constantinople's fall. In return for his subordination, Demetrios and his household were given estates in Thrace, where the former despot would live until his natural death in 1470. In the months after the siege, the Albanian revolt of Peter Boer was put down again, while dozens of towns all across the region began mass surrendering to the Sultan. By the end of the year, all of Morea, with the exception of Venetian possessions in the region and the town of Menemvasia, had surrendered to Ottoman authorities. Unlike his brother, Thomas did not attempt to strike a deal with Mehmed and fled alongside his household to first Venetian-controlled Corfu and then to Rome, where he would unsuccessfully push for a crusade against the Ottomans. The former despot would die in 1465, but not before claiming the imperial title of Emperor of Constantinople. After his death, his eldest son and heir, Andreas, continued pushing for a crusade, until he was forced to sell all of his titles to first King Charles VIII of France, then later to Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, due to financial troubles. After over 200 years since Michael VIII's ascension to power in Constantinople, the Palaiologos dynasty had now ceased to rule over any lands in their name. While the Palaiologos dynasty came to an effective end, a far more illustrious Roman dynasty of the Komneni family still ruled from Trebizond in far-off eastern Anatolia. Originally coming to power in 1081, the family had ruled over the Byzantine Empire before being deposed in 1185 after the tyrannic reign of Andronikos I. However, by the time of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the grandchildren of the deposed emperor had managed to carve out a section of the empire for themselves and their successors in eastern Anatolia, centered in the city of Trebizond. It was from here that the Komneni family would rule over the next 200 years. Under the reign of Alexios III, the state entered its golden age as the city of Trebizond became an important trading hub in the Black Sea and also a center for the arts and Byzantine architecture. Nonetheless, this golden age would end with the death of Alexios III in 1390, which coincided with the start of Sultan Bayezid I's thunderous campaigns of consolidation in Anatolia against the Turkic beyliks of the region. By the turn of the century, it seemed as if the armies of the Sultan would sweep the empire of Trebizond off the map, but the disastrous Ottoman defeat at the Battle of Ankara would deter such Turkish ambitions for another half-century. During this time of brief respite, the rulers of Trebizond adopted a diplomatic strategy of marrying off female members of their dynasty to neighbouring Turkic powers to protect themselves against the Ottomans. Such Turkic powers in the past included the Beylik of Taceddin, the Karakoyunlu, and most recently the Akkoyunlu, under their ambitious ruler Sultan Uzun Hasan. After a destructive Ottoman raid in 1456, which saw the capturing and ransoming of 2,000 Pontic Greeks, John IV became an official Ottoman vassal, paying the Sublime Porte an annual tribute of 3,000 ducats. However, the unsatisfied Trapezuntine ruler would spend the rest of the decade discreetly building up a military coalition against Mehmed II, which included the Karamanids, Jandarids, the Akkoyunlu, and Christian princes of Georgia and Mingrelia. Nonetheless, such grand plans for an anti-Ottoman alliance were cut short by the death of John in 1460 and the ascension of his nephew, the 9-year-old Alexios V. The reign of the child emperor was to be brief, as his uncle, David Komnenos, usurped power in the capital after only a few months, thus imprisoning the young Alexios and his supporters. With Trebizond having missed its last few annual tributes to the Sublime Porte and political instability running rampant in the country, Mehmed II decided to undertake a military campaign against the Roman rump state in 1461. Gathering a massive army of over 50,000 in Bursa and over 100 ships in Constantinople, the Sultan marched east to the tune of war drums. The rulers of eastern Anatolia, and even many in the Ottoman military, did not know Mehmed's true ambitions, instead believing that the campaign to come was going to be directed at the Karamanids, or even the Mamluks of Egypt. When confronted by a military judge about the plans for the upcoming campaign, Mehmed responded, "If the hair of my beard knew my plans, I would pull it out and burn it." It was only when the army reached Ankara that the Ottoman Sultan shared his true intentions with his officers. Having known about John IV's secret coalition, Mehmed suddenly began marching his host north towards the Jandarid Beylik. In a short siege, the Jandarid capital of Sinop was captured, and the rest of the Beylik was annexed. The army then marched toward the Akkoyunlu town of Erzincan, and the region was laid to waste by Ottoman raiders, resulting in the desperate Uzun Hasan concluding a hasty peace with Mehmed. Now that Emperor David was isolated from all of his local allies, the joint Ottoman army and navy besieged Trebizond in July of 1461. However, unlike Constantine XI, the violent 32-day siege on his capital proved too much for the Trapezuntine monarch. Panicking at the sight of Mehmed's grand host beneath his walls, David surrendered the city upon the Sultan's promise of granting him and his household estates in the Balkans, similar to the deal struck with the deposed despot Demetrios a year prior. Gathering all their wealth, the entire Komneni family was transported to Constantinople by year's end, thus officially ending the Trebizond Empire. Yet, unlike the Palaiologi, the fate of the Komneni was to end in bloodshed. Seeing the Trapezuntine imperial family as a significant threat to his claim as Caesar of Rome, Mehmed imprisoned David and his 3 sons alongside the deposed Alexios V in 1463. Shortly after their imprisonment, all 5 male members of the House of Komneni were executed, with David's daughter Anne entering the Sultan's harem. With Morea and Trebizond conquered, Sultan Mehmed II had now become the undisputed sole Caesar of the Romans. However, if Mehmed thought he had finally achieved peace in his realm, he would be sorely mistaken, as a certain impaling voivode in Wallachia would ignite a bloody war in the Balkans in the following years. For many centuries, the Wallachians of Eastern Europe, also known as the Vlachs, had been at the epicenter of countless converging civilizations, such as the Eastern Romans, Bulgarians, Pechenegs, Kuman Kipchaks, and the Mongols. However, the origins of the Principality of Wallachia as an independent polity began in the early 14th century. By the start of the century, the numerous Orthodox Vlach boyars of the Lower Danube and the southern Carpathians had been nominal vassals of the mighty Kingdom of Hungary. Seeking independence from their Catholic overlords, the petty Vlach lords of this region united under the leadership of Basarab I, and by doing so, achieved a surprising and decisive victory over the Hungarians at the Battle of Tosada in 1330. In spite of gaining independence, Wallachia was to spend the rest of its existence surrounded by its more potent neighbours. By the 1390s, the Ottoman armies had absorbed the majority of Bulgaria and vassalized Serbia after the Battle of Kosovo. With Muslim raiders now raiding north of the Danube, it seemed like the Vlachs were the next in a long list of peoples that had submitted to the Ottoman war machine. In spite of the odds, a stubborn and energetic Mehmed I of Wallachia was to hinder such ambitions for over 30 years. During his reign, the voivode achieved what many in Christian Europe could not during the period, defeating the Ottoman Sultan in open battle, not only once but twice at the battles of Karanvasa and Rovina in 1394 and 1395. Ushering in a military golden age, Mehmed was able to keep his principality independent from both the Hungarians and the Ottomans, even managing to expand his realm into northern Dobruja, the lower Danube delta, and parts of Transylvania by the end of the century. Despite these successes, this golden age would end with the death of Mehmed in 1418, and what followed was a constant violent civil war between the two cadet houses of the Basarab dynasty, the Daneshti and Strakuleshti. During this instability, the lands of the realm contracted, while members of each cadet house pledged their allegiance to either Hungary or the Ottomans for political and military support against fellow rival claimants. As a result, Wallachia had become a crucial buffer state for both the Hungarians and the Turks in their wider wars across the Balkans. By the 1440s, Vlad II of Wallachia would play an unwinnable balancing game of trying to gain favour with both of the two royal courts of Buda and Edirne for the survival of his regime. This entailed the voivode constantly switching allegiances between the two sides, and even giving away his second and third eldest sons, Vlad and Radu, as political hostages to the Sultan's court. However, such acts of playing both sides proved futile, as the voivode was dethroned by his Daneshti relative, the pro-Hungarian Vladislav II, who had the military backing of John Hunyadi. The voivode was killed in 1447, along with his eldest son Mircea II. According to Balkan chronicles, the boyars of Targovishte ripped out Mircea's eyes before proceeding to bury him alive. At the same time, Vlad himself fled into hiding before being brutally assassinated in the marshes near the capital. Meanwhile, the young sons of the slain Wallachian ruler would continue to live in the Sultan's court of Edirne for a number of years, where they were given an Ottoman education and trained alongside the elite janissaries. Yet an opportunity arose for the older of the two boys, Vlad, in the fall of 1448, when the Ottoman and Crusader armies of Murat II and Hunyadi faced off at the Second Battle of Kosovo. Wallachia had been left virtually undefended during the military campaign, as Vladislav II and his army had marched alongside the Crusader host, thus allowing Vlad to easily usurp power in the country as a pro-Ottoman ruler. However, his reign would last only 2 months, because despite the Crusaders' defeat in Kosovo, Vladislav returned with the remnant of his army and reclaimed his throne. After being exiled from his homeland once more, the Draculeshti prince first sought shelter in Edirne, before settling down in the Principality of Moldavia and later in Transylvania. He would spend the next 7 years building up a political base of support in Brezhov, with other exiled Vlach notables in the local region. While the Ottoman and Hungarian armies were preoccupied over the fortress city of Belgrade in the summer of 1456, the exiled voivode, seeking revenge for the past murders of his late father and brother, entered into Wallachia at the head of a mercenary force from southern Transylvania. The following war was to be short. By convincing Vladislav to engage in single combat for the fate of their homeland, Vlad succeeded in delivering a fatal blow to the man who had inflicted great pain upon him over the past decade. Upon re-entering Targovishte, the new voivode began consolidating his power by appointing loyal followers into high political offices, while at the same time confiscating the wealth of boyars who had been faithful to the previous regime. With this wealth, Vlad constructed new fortifications and roads, reformed the army, and ultimately initiated the building of a brand new city, Bucharest. Like his late father, the Wallachian ruler also began a correspondence with the royal courts of Buda and Constantinople, in which he pledged his full loyalty to the Hungarian king, while at the same time sending a yearly tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. However, as Vlad III consolidated his power in the country, he gained a reputation for being a cruel ruler throughout Europe, as he often burned and impaled his political enemies in great showcases of brutality. Petty criminals, beggars, and even whole villages that were considered disloyal to the crown were also subjected to the stake during this reign of terror. The peak of these horrific actions against his fellow countrymen occurred during an Easter banquet in 1457 at the capital, which was later to be known by folklore as the Easter Massacre. The brutal event saw a paranoid Vlad delivering a speech in front of 200 guests, primarily consisting of boyars and their families, before ordering their execution and impalement for alleged treason against his late father and brother. This iron-fisted and cruel method of governing his realm was likely influenced by Vlad's childhood traumas stemming from his early days in exile across the Balkans. Moreover, the constantly turbulent nature of Wallachian politics may have influenced the young ruler to take drastic actions to secure his throne from potential pretenders and court rivals. Whatever the reasoning was, in Vlad's new Wallachia, fear now became a unifying force with which to exert power. With Hunyadi's death in 1456 and Vlad's impalement of all allegedly disloyal Saxon merchants in Wallachia, relations between Buda and Targovishte began to sour by the end of the decade. By 1460, a new pro-Hungarian pretender, Dan III, invaded Wallachia with military support from the Saxon nobility of Transylvania. However, Dan's army was ambushed and decimated near the town of Rutsar in a brief one-sided battle. After the engagement, the Doneshti prince was humiliated into digging his own grave before being beheaded by Vlad himself. In the wake of his significant victory, the Wallachian voivode invaded and pillaged a number of Saxon settlements in southern Transylvania, impaling thousands throughout the region. While Sultan Mehmed II was on his military campaign against Trebizond in 1461, an Ottoman delegation was sent to Wallachia as Vlad had failed to pay his annual tribute to the Sultan for the last 3 years. The voivode excused his failed payments on his war with the Saxon nobles of Transylvania, but the mood between the two courts had already soured a year prior with the execution of a Turkish envoy. Hamza Pasha, the provincial governor of Nicopolis, led the Ottoman delegation and was responsible for collecting the withheld Wallachian tribute, along with 1,000 Wallachian boys for the Sultan's Janissary Corps. However, his secret mission was to kidnap the Wallachian ruler and bring him to Constantinople to answer for his crimes against an Ottoman official. In spite of the secrecy of the operation, Vlad was informed about the true mission of the Turkish delegation by his many spies in the Balkans. Upon entering Wallachia at the head of a 1,000-strong cavalry host, the Ottoman governor was ambushed by Vlad and was later impaled alongside many other of his officers. In the days after this great ambush, Vlad marched on the border Ottoman fortress town of Giurgiu, located north of the Danube. Dressed in full Turkish military attire and speaking fluent Turkish, the voivode was able to trick the garrison of the town into opening its gates. Before long, the nearby Wallachian army stormed into the town, killing its entire garrison. Soon after the capture of Giurgiu, Vlad would launch perhaps one of the most violent expeditions in medieval European history by invading Ottoman Bulgaria at the start of 1462. With most of the Ottoman army still campaigning in distant Anatolia, hundreds of defenseless villages and towns were set ablaze, and their populations were massacred by impalement, including thousands of women and children. All in all, over 28,000 Turks and Bulgarians were killed in only a few weeks, and thousands more fled south towards Constantinople, sharing gruesome stories of the Wallachian ruler along the way. On top of the mass killings, all Ottoman supply depots in northern Bulgaria and crossing points over the Danube were burnt down. Upon hearing of the horrific news coming out of the Balkans, an ever-so-rageful Mehmed II rushed back to his capital to prepare for war. Mustering the largest Ottoman army seen since his siege on Constantinople 9 years prior, the Sultan was eager to punish his vassal, whom he had grown up with since his days as a prince in Edirne. With a grand army of 60,000 to 80,000 strong and a fleet of over 170 ships, Mehmed personally marched on Wallachia in April of 1462. Also with the Sultan was Prince Radu, Vlad's younger brother, who had spent the last 2 decades living at the Ottoman court. Unlike his elder brother, the Wallachian prince had been a steadfast friend to Mehmed and was deemed loyal enough to command 4,000 Janissaries for the campaign to come. Having fully embraced Ottoman customs during his time in captivity, Radu was promised control over Wallachia by the Sultan once his brother was overthrown and executed. As Ottoman forces amassed, Vlad began mustering a host himself, between 10,000 to 20,000 strong, made up chiefly of peasants, mercenaries, and a corps of elite Vlach cavalry. Like Mircea I before him, the Wallachian voivode planned on using guerrilla tactics in familiar terrain to defeat a numerically superior foreign foe. Military assistance from Hungary was also anticipated, but with no updates about a Western army arriving to support them by summer, Vlad started getting ready to confront the impending Ottoman attack on his own. By June 1462, the Ottoman army had arrived at the Danube and began crossing the great river from the port towns of Vidin and Nicopolis. Although the Wallachians heavily contested the landings, Turkish artillery power in Nicopolis had won the Ottoman army a bridgehead into the country. Meanwhile, the Ottoman navy, under Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha, began bombarding the town of Braila, Wallachia's only port settlement, setting it ablaze. After a few days of crossing the Danube, Mehmed's host began marching north toward Vlad's capital of Targovishte in full force. While marching up north, Ottoman Akinci raiders, led by Mihalolu Ali Bey, fanned out and began pillaging and burning the Wallachian countryside, killing many in retribution for Vlad's killings earlier in the year. During this chaos, the Wallachian ruler ordered a scorched earth policy along Mehmed's line of march to the capital. Wells were poisoned, livestock killed, crops burned, towns abandoned, and guerrilla warfare commenced in the region's many dense forests and thick marshes. Although effective in preventing the fall of the fortress town of Bucharest to Mehmed, such tactics proved largely ineffective in stopping the Ottoman army in its march to the Wallachian capital. Reluctant to engage in a set-piece battle, Vlad planned to launch an assault on the Ottoman camp south of Targovishte during the night of June 16th to 17th, aiming specifically to dismantle the Turkish command structure by eliminating the Sultan himself. In the hours before the ambush, the Wallachian ruler disguised himself as a Turkish merchant to enter the Ottoman camp and locate the Sultan's tent. Launching his night ambush at 11 p.m., Vlad's host of 7,000 to 10,000 men attacked the Ottoman camp in 2 detachments. With torches lighting the night sky and sounds of horns echoing off tents, an air of chaos filled the Ottoman camp as Wallachian light cavalry surprisingly broke through its wooden palisades. Simultaneously, Wallachian troops, disguised in captured Turkish military attire, wreaked havoc on already confused Ottoman troops, many of which were slain in their sleep. For hours, the nighttime struggle continued as Vlad spotted the Sultan's tent in the distance. However, in the chaos, the Wallachian ruler instead broke into the Grand Vizier's nearby tent, which was empty. As sunrise approached, Mehmed remained safe and sound, and his janissaries had managed to stabilize the situation. Feeling satisfied in inflicting significant Ottoman losses, estimated to be as high as 10,000, Vlad ordered his hosts to retreat into the dense forests east of the capital. Regardless, in this frenetic retreat, over 1,000 Wallachians would be killed and beheaded by the Akinci raiders of Mihalolu Ali Bey. With that, the infamous night attack at Targovishte concluded. Although unsuccessful at killing the Sultan, Vlad's nighttime ambush proved a huge morale shock to the Ottoman army, which had already been exhausted after weeks of marching through the scorched fields of Wallachia. 2 weeks after the crossing of the Danube, the weary Ottoman army arrived beneath the walls of Targovishte and began preparing for a siege. However, surprisingly, the capital's gates were left open, as its local populace had abandoned the city and fled to the Carpathian Mountains in the days prior. As Mehmed's host occupied Targovishte, an even more shocking development was discovered in the city's outskirts. To the horror of the army, thousands of their brethren in arms and slain countrymen were found impaled in a massive forest of mounted stakes. The rotten corpse of Hamza Pasha was also found on top of the highest stake, symbolizing his high ranking within the Ottoman military. As the deathly forest of stakes was cleared, Mehmed installed Prince Radu in power to gather the support of the local boyars against Vlad. This would prove to be easy, as many such boyars and merchants of Wallachia had been disenfranchised during Vlad's reign of terror and the recent Ottoman War, and so they hurled their support to the more charismatic Radu. Within only weeks, Vlad's support in the country collapsed, and many settlements like Bucharest opened their gates to the new ruler of Wallachia. With his Wallachian campaign seeming to be winding down, Mehmed and his host began marching east towards the port town of Braila, where the Ottoman fleet had been docked. During his eastern march, the Sultan had also sent a military detachment to assist Vlad's cousin, Stefan III of Moldavia, in his siege on Wallachian-held Kilia. After his night ambush, Vlad had garrisoned the Black Sea fortress with 7,000 soldiers, diverting his total strength against the Ottomans to his west. Despite Mehmed's advancing host, This move was to prove vital, as the opportunistic Moldavian voivode was forced to lift the siege after suffering major losses against the defenders and being wounded in the ankle. Returning from Kilia, the Wallachian voivode decided to ambush Mehmed's army one last time, in an attempt to reclaim his realm. However, this attempt was to prove fruitless, as the Ottoman host, encamped near the town of Buzau, was able to easily repel the ambush during the evening of June 22nd or 23rd. During the engagement, over 2,000 Wallachians fell dead, and later their heads were mounted on Turkish lances. Losing all momentum from his victory at Kilia, Vlad would retreat towards the Carpathians in defeat, with the remnants of his once mighty host. As most of Vlad's supporters defected to Radu after the great defeat, Mehmed concluded his Wallachian campaign on June 28th by entering Braila and sailing with his forces back to Constantinople. Meanwhile, the new Wallachian ruler, with the help of Ottoman auxiliary troops, would spend the rest of the summer chasing Vlad and his supporters in the northern reaches of his realm. Having cornered the Impaler prince at his favourite residence at Poenarik Castle, all seemed over for him, but in a surprising move, Vlad was able to slip out of the siege and cross the border into Hungarian Transylvania. However, being politically isolated due to his past campaign of terror in the local region, Vlad found little support for his cause to retake his throne. Not wanting to start a war with the Ottomans over Radu's ascension, and unable to trust him for his past transgressions against the crown, Vlad was imprisoned by local Hungarian authorities by the fall of 1462. The infamous Wallachian voivode, who had impaled tens of thousands of his subjects and countless foes during his reign of terror, was set to spend the next 13 years in a jail cell in the town of Visegrad. During his captivity, tales of his cruelty spread across wider Europe, often depicting the former Wallachian voivode as a bloodthirsty monster resembling the devil. Fast forward to the 19th century, however, and Vlad III Dracula would become an integral part of Romanian national identity, being seen as a brave Romanian ruler who had defied Ottoman aggression with his cruel but effective tactics. With Wallachia once again entering into Ottoman vassalage in 1462, here came the end of the most infamous chapter of Vlad's life, but his story was not yet concluded. The sudden fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks had caused a brief shock all across Christian Europe. 4 months after the Great Siege, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull entitled Etsi Ecclesia Christi. In this declaration, the Bishop of Rome described Sultan Mehmed II as a rabid beast and a herald of the Antichrist, and commanded all Christian princes, whether imperial, kingly, queenly, ducal, or other worldly dignity they might hold, to come to the defense of the Christian religion and of the faith with their goods and persons as genuinely and insistently as is possible. However, such a call was to fall on deaf ears. Other than convening a few imperial diets, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III was more preoccupied with internal struggles in his realm, feuding with his scheming brother Albert VI of Austria, and butting heads with Hungary. Meanwhile, other major Catholic nations, particularly those in Iberia, were too preoccupied with the Reconquista against the Muslim nations in what is now Spain to provide any substantial assistance. At the same time, a war-weary England and France had only recently concluded the 100 Years' War in 1453, and now the former was sucked into the bloody Wars of the Roses. It appeared that Europe was too preoccupied with internal matters to engage effectively against the Ottoman Turks. Even after its great victory over Mehmed at Belgrade, the Kingdom of Hungary found itself preoccupied with domestic strife. To fully understand the dilemmas that Hungary faced during this period, we must first turn back the clock. Back in 1452, Frederick III had been forced by his nobility to end his guardianship over the exiled teenage Ladislaus V of Hungary after a decade of fighting with Buda. The following year, the exiled young king returned to his homeland and was crowned in Buda, while John Hunyadi resigned from his role as regent, instead taking the office of General Captain of the Kingdom. Although his political flair had been very much reduced after his defeat at the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448, the Hungarian magnate still continued to rule most of the kingdom's many royal castles and revenues. However, the surprising death of Hunyadi in 1456, mere months after his victory at Belgrade, would give Ladislaus and his core supporters in the capital an opportunity to seize power from his family. The king first appointed John Hunyadi's former court rival, Ulrich of Scilly, as the new general captain of Hungary. But yet more inflammatory were his orders to the late magnate's two sons, Ladislaus and Matthias, to renounce all their inherited holdings and revenues to the crown. Instead of bending to the royal order, the elder Ladislaus murdered Ulrich and even captured the king himself during a state visit to Belgrade, thus sparking a period of high tension within the kingdom. Although initially pardoned for his actions, Ladislaus was later charged by the king with treason, and was later imprisoned and beheaded in Buda as civil war became imminent in Hungary. However, before a full-scale war could erupt between the forces of the crown and the supporters of Hunyadi, King Ladislaus V suddenly died at the age of 17 from an unknown disease by the end of the year. With the Albertinian line now extinct and civil war averted, the 15-year-old Matthias Hunyadi was elected to the throne by the Hungarian nobility in the early weeks of 1458, with his uncle Michael Szilágyi serving as regent. Despite this peaceful resolution, the mounting unpopularity of the new king's policy of revoking noble privileges and attempts to build a new centralized army had led to unrest amongst the disenchanted Hungarian nobility. With the dismissal of Regent Szilágyi during the summer of 1459, a new succession crisis erupted in the kingdom as 25 Hungarian nobles revolted against the crown in favour of electing Frederick III as Hungarian king. What followed was a political dispute that lasted 4 years, which gave the Ottomans the opportunity to skillfully annex Serbia in 1459 and vassalize Wallachia in 1462. With Hungary in turmoil and Vlad III defeated, Mehmed II turned his sights to the Aegean, in particular the Genoese island of Lesbos. Since 1453, the Sultan had waged wars of aggression against the various Genoese colonies in the Aegean and Black Seas to strengthen his hold over both regions. In 1454, the Genoese holdings in the Crimean Peninsula were raided, and its regional capital, Kaffa, was besieged unsuccessfully, in partnership with the Crimean Khan Hadjar I Giray. In 1456, the Aegean islands of Imbros, Samothrake, Lemnos, Tenedos and Thassos were captured, alongside the mainland settlement of Aenos. Lastly, in 1460, the Black Sea port town of Amasra surrendered to Mehmed's navy during a 2-day siege. Only the last holding of the Genoese Gattilusio family of Lesbos stood in between the Sultan and his desire to control the mouth of the Dardanelles Strait. Disembarking south during the summer of 1462, at the head of a 20,000-strong army, Mehmed first visited the ancient ruins of Troy. There he lamented the destruction of the famous city and expressed satisfaction at avenging the Asian peoples against the Greeks with his conquest of Constantinople. With his immense love for classical history, the Ottoman monarch formed a new narrative, in which his empire became the spiritual successor to the ancient Trojan kingdom of Priam, Hector and Paris. After touring Troy and after many months of preparation, Mehmed launched his military campaign to take Lesbos in early fall of 1462. Crossing with his fleet of 100 ships, he personally led an Ottoman army to Mytilene, the capital of the island, and put it under siege. For over 2 weeks, Turkish forces bombarded the city's fortifications, and despite some initial resistance, the defenders were outgunned and outnumbered, and so surrendered. With the Gattilusio family first captured and later executed, the island of Lesbos was annexed, thus eliminating the last Christian foothold close to the Ottoman capital. A year after his victorious campaign in Lesbos, Mehmed II now turned his gaze to the Balkans, in particular the Kingdom of Bosnia. Since the 14th century, Bosnia had been nominally under Hungary's authority as a Banat. However, over time, it had gradually grown more autonomous. The turning point came with Ban Tvrtko I, a resourceful politician and military leader who, after many years of intrigues against the Hungarians and taking advantage of the collapse of the Serbian Empire, crowned himself as King of Bosnia and Serbia in 1377. He was to be the first ruler of an independent Bosnian state, a culturally and religiously diverse state that included Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and members of the indigenous Bosnian Church, a sect considered heretical by both Rome and Constantinople. Tvrtko's long reign was to be marked by territorial expansion, diplomatic skill and military success as he expanded his kingdom's borders to include not only Bosnia, but also parts of Herzegovina, Dalmatia, parts of Serbia, and even some coastal territories along the Adriatic Sea. Regardless, the death of Tvrtko saw Bosnia's fortunes reverse for the worse. Between the 1390s and the 1450s, Turkish raiders periodically plundered the kingdom as the central authority in the realm began to fracture due to noble rivalries, a fragmented religious landscape, and political instability. Ottoman sultans during this period also often extracted tribute from Bosnia as its petty rulers now desperately looked for Western aid. By 1461, King Stefan II Tomašević had ascended to the Bosnian throne, and with promised military support from Hungary and the papacy, chose to sever diplomatic ties with Constantinople by refusing to pay his annual tribute to the Sultan. In response to the Bosnian king's actions, an outraged Mehmed gathered an army of 20,000 to 30,000 in the spring of 1463 and decided to invade Stefan's domains. The Ottoman army, under the Sultan and Grand Vizier, crossed into Bosnia through the Drina River and advanced rapidly throughout the local countryside. On May 19th, the army had arrived at the walls of Bobovac. The highly fortified town had been the royal seat of the kingdom, but in the weeks leading up to the invasion, the king had relocated his court further west to Jajce. Stefan believed that the high walls of Bobovac would bog down the invaders, giving him time to muster an army. Unfortunately for the Bosnian king, Mehmed had brought large cannons with him and began bombarding the town in full force. After only 3 days of terror, Bobovac surrendered when its garrison leader, Knez Radak, accepted a hefty bribe from the Grand Vizier. However, when the Bosnian leader had an audience with the Sultan, he was accused of betraying his liege lord in his time of need. Mehmed violently accused Radak of treason and ordered his beheading. After ordering his execution, it is reported that the Sultan shouted to Radak, "If you could not keep faith with a lord of your own faith, then how can you be expected to keep faith with me, a Turk?" The sudden fall of Bobovac had been a massive shock to King Stefan, who began quickly writing letters to Hungary and the Pope for military assistance immediately. In the coming week, his half-mustered armies had been routed and destroyed in front of the walls of Kutz by the forces of the Grand Vizier. As many Bosnian nobles surrendered en masse, Stefan retreated to his well-fortified stronghold of Jajce as Hungarian and papal support was nowhere to be seen. Mehmed followed suit and besieged the Bosnian king at his fortress alongside his army's now renowned artillery corps. After some brief resistance, the walls of Jajce were breached, and Stefan was captured and later beheaded alongside various members of his household and nobility. The swift Ottoman conquest of Bosnia was completed within only a matter of weeks, much to the shock of Europe. Bosnia's incorporation into the Ottoman Empire was to be steadfast, as a means not to alienate its ruling nobility during the annexation process. In 1465, the former king's first cousin, Matija Sabenčić, was installed as an Ottoman puppet king to the region, followed by Matija Vojsalić in 1472 until he was deposed in 1476. The two men ruled a small area in the Lashva Valley, while Ottoman marcher lord Isabej Išiković ruled the rest of the region. Meanwhile, the southern rump state of Herzegovina, also known as the Duchy of St. Sava, continued to resist Ottoman rule under its Duke Stefan Vukčić Kosača. But after his death in 1466, Stefan's youngest son, Vlatko Herzegovich, would take control of the duchy, but not before submitting to Ottoman vassalship. With that, a vast majority of Bosnia was now under direct or nominal Muslim rule. While Christendom was distracted by internal struggles, and Lesbos and Bosnia came under Ottoman control, the Albanian revolt continued to be a flame of resistance against the Sublime Porte under its steadfast and vigilant leader Skanderbeg. In the wake of his great victory at the Battle of Albalena in 1457, Pope Calixtus III had given the Albanian leader the title of Athleta Christi, meaning Champion of Christ, while affirming that he was a stout bastion against the fury of the unbridled Turks. Further showcasing his now famous martial prowess, Skanderbeg embarked on an Italian expedition between 1460 and 1462, successfully defending the throne of his liege lord, Ferdinand I of Naples, during a local civil war. Upon his return, the Albanian lord again swiftly demonstrated he had lost none of his edge against the Ottomans, defeating a three-pronged Turkish invasion into his domains during the summer of 1462. During the triple battles of Mocha, Polog and Livad, up to 20,000 Turks were killed, captured or wounded, thus further building up Skanderbeg's legend as a holy resistance fighter. Exhausted after many years of war, Mehmed agreed on a 10-year truce with Skanderbeg during the spring of 1463. However, this ceasefire was not destined to last until the end of the year, as it had finally dawned on Western leaders that Albania, and not Hungary, could be used to launch further crusades against the Turks. This realization began at the Council of Mantua in 1459, when Pope Pius II called for collective Christian action against an ever-expanding Ottoman Empire. Fearing the growth of Ottoman naval power in the Aegean Sea after the fall of Lesbos, Venice would not only renew its peace treaty with Albania in 1463, but also enter into an alliance with Philip III of Burgundy and Matthias of Hungary against Mehmed with papal mediation. With high hopes, a crusader host was planned to be mustered at the port town of Ancona, where it would sail off to the aid of Albania come the following year. With the prospect of receiving active support for the first time in his struggle against the Turks, Skanderbeg responded to the papal summons for a crusade by declaring a holy war on the Ottomans. In the grand strategic plan envisioned by the Pope, the armies of Albania and Burgundy would attack the Turks from the west, while the Hungarians would advance from the north and the Venetians from the south. However, such a venture was to be fleeting. By the summer of 1464, Crusader contingents arriving in Ancona had to deal with plague, and the Crusade's main political backer, Pius II, had died, thus hampering any thoughts of holy war against Mehmed. With Burgundy backing out of the crusade at the last second, and Hungary uninterested in going into full-on war so soon after its struggle against Austria, Venice and Albania were left to deal with the Ottoman menace on their own. Wanting to go on the offensive before the Sultan could retaliate for breaking the truce, Skanderbeg led an army of 12,000 Albanians and 1,000 Venetians, with which he invaded and plundered Ottoman northern Macedonia in the fall of 1464. In yet another ambush, this time near Ohrid, the Albanian lord was able to rout and destroy yet another Ottoman provincial army, inflicting over 10,000 Turkish casualties. The following spring, another Ottoman provincial army, under the command of Balaban Bada, invaded Albania with a force of over 18,000 Akinci raiders. Although defeated at Baikal, the Albanian Devshirme child turned Ottoman Pasha had managed to inflict heavy losses to Skanderbeg, including the capture of over 20 of his military officers, like the pardoned Moisi Arianiti. After many weeks of being paraded back to Constantinople, the Albanian officers were then executed, and their corpses were thrown to the dogs of the capital. In the summer of 1465, two more Ottoman provincial armies invaded Albania in a two-pronged assault, led again by Balaban Bada and Jakub Pasha. In the first battle of the campaign at Mechad, Balaban was able to surround and heavily injure Skanderbeg, but not before an Albanian cavalry charge routed his army. The two men would meet again a few months later at Baikal, which saw the repeat of the first battle, a Pyrrhic Albanian victory. A few days later at Kashari, Skanderbeg would again ambush another Ottoman army and capture and kill its commander, Jakub Pasha. In retaliation for the execution of the Albanian officers the previous year, all Turkish captives on the campaign were executed, thus resulting in over 15,000 casualties for the Sublime Porte in only 3 months. As the Ottomans were dealt defeat once more in the forested mountains of Albania, their forces in Greece had to deal with the forces of the Doge. Although Turkish troops were unexpectedly able to capture the fortress town of Argos in 1463, a Venetian counterattack later that year saw forces under Alvise Loredan retake the town and start advancing into Ottoman territory in the Morea. The ruins of the Hexamilian Wall across the Isthmus of Corinth were reoccupied and rebuilt, while the Acrocorinth fortress was put under siege. However, with limited men and resources, this Christian expedition was to meet an abrupt end, as a surprise Turkish sally-out operation from the fortress town would rout the Venetians back to the Hexamilion. With the arrival of Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha later that year, Ottoman forces would again retake Argos and put their efforts into raiding the remaining Venetian possessions in the Morea. Although his armies were victorious on land, Mehmed II was more focused on his naval capabilities, as he was quoted saying, "Venice is a serpent in the sea. beautiful from afar but dangerous when near. As a result of this concern, he ordered the construction of the twin fortresses of Kilidilbar and Sultaniya at the mouth of the Dardanelles Strait to safeguard his capital from the superior naval forces of the Doge. The Sultan also ordered the construction of a new naval yard in Constantinople, dubbed the Kadirga Limani, to increase naval strength at sea. Nevertheless, news from Bosnia would call forth Mehmed's attention later that year, as King Matthias invaded the region with his newly established Black Army. Although not fully committed to a full-on war with Constantinople, the Hungarian king took advantage of Turkish preoccupation in the Morea and the Aegean to secure his southern borders in Bosnia. The fortress of Yeizer fell after a 3-month siege in the winter of 1463, and its garrison under Yusuf Bey defected to the king's army. This sudden foreign threat prompted the Sultan to march on Bosnia again the following year, with an army of 20,000 troops. By the summer, Mehmed's host had reached Yeizer in full force. But in spite of besieging the fortress for over a month, the vigilant Hungarian defense held out and inflicted heavy Turkish casualties. The Hungarians, emboldened by their defense of Yeizer, attempted to press their advantage further. King Matthias advanced into eastern Bosnia and besieged the fortress of Zvornik, a key Ottoman stronghold on the Drina River linking Bosnia to Serbia. The king aimed to capture the fortress and sever Ottoman lines of communication, thereby destabilizing Ottoman control of Bosnia. Hearing the news of the Black Army crossing the Sava River, led by their king, Mehmed decided not to risk an open battle and retreated to friendly territory. The siege began in the late summer of 1464, with Matthias bringing a considerable Hungarian army to bear against the fortress. Initially, the Hungarians pressed hard, expecting to overwhelm the Ottoman defenders and secure a swift victory. However, the garrison at Zvornik, composed of seasoned Ottoman soldiers, mounted a determined resistance. The defenders skillfully used the fortress's natural position on the Drina and its fortifications to withstand repeated Hungarian assaults. As the fighting dragged on, the Hungarians found themselves in increasingly precarious circumstances. Ottoman relief forces under Mihalolu Ali Bey approached from the east, threatening to trap Matthias's army between the garrison and his reinforcements. Harassed by counterattacks and struggling with supply shortages as the fall approached, the Hungarians suffered mounting casualties. Despite initial optimism, it became clear that the fortress would not fall easily. Facing the prospect of encirclement, Matthias was forced to abandon the siege and retreat from Bosnia. The siege of Zvornik ended in an Ottoman victory, marking a turning point in the 1464 campaigns. Although the Hungarians had managed to hold Yeizer after Mehmed's failed siege earlier that year, their inability to capture Zvornik ensured that the Ottomans retained control over eastern Bosnia and its vital links to Serbia. As a result, Bosnia emerged from the campaigns of 1463 and 1464 divided, with the Ottomans controlling its heartland, while Hungary held on to Yeizer and the northern fortresses. For decades afterward, this contested borderland remained a theatre of constant warfare, shaping the destiny of Bosnia as a frontier province of two competing powers. The winter of 1464 to 1465 was to be the lowest point in Mehmed II's reign. The Sultan spent the winter in his imperial palace, forging new war plans for the coming spring. However, to his consternation, his household troops were long exhausted after years of hard military campaigning and long marches in the Balkans and Anatolia. Consequently, they were on the brink of rebellion. The Sultan himself had also been in poor physical condition after his Bosnian campaign, growing so ill that for the first time in his reign, he spent over a year in Constantinople. The illness itself was most likely gout, or inflammation of the joints, a condition that would flare up during the harsh conditions of his military campaigns. As a result of his army's fatigue and his health condition, Mehmed set aside the year 1465 as a rest period, during which he demobilized many of his provincial and household troops. Instead of engaging in war, the Sultan now devoted his time to the development of his capital city, and to discussing philosophy and history with the European intellectuals of his court. As Mehmed II spent the entire year of 1465 resting his armies and recovering from physical ailments in Constantinople, he began planning for the next campaign season. Not one to remain idle in his imperial palace, the Sultan decided to march on Albania in person at the head of an army to crush Skanderbeg's revolt once and for all. The target was the rebel capital of Kruji, the mountain fortress that Murad II had unsuccessfully besieged 15 years earlier. After many years of hearing news about defeats in the region, Mehmed believed only he alone could extinguish the flame of the Albanian revolt, which had been burning for over 20 years now. While the Ottoman army was being mustered for war, Venice took advantage of the Sultan's inaction over the past year to seize the islands of Lemnos, Imbros, Thassos and Samothraki. Lesbos and its capital, Mytilene, were also put under siege but were repelled by the island's local Turkish garrison. Peace negotiations had also fallen apart, as military engagements in the Morea and the Aegean Sea escalated tensions between the two sides. However, such Ottoman counteractions against the Italian Merchant Republic were put on hold, as Mehmed focused all of his strength and attention on Albania for the upcoming year. Leaving his capital at the head of a 30,000-strong host, the Sultan arrived in Albania during the summer of 1466. Once more, Ottoman raiders burned and pillaged the countryside, enslaving many during their campaign of terror. Furthermore, to prevent future Albanian ambushes against Turkish forces, the forests along the main roads in the region were cleared. Once the path to Kruja was opened, Mehmed marched his grand army to its gates and laid siege to the fortress. Meanwhile, Skanderbeg had requested military aid from Venice and fiscal support against the Turkish invasion, but the forces of the Doge were too preoccupied in the Morea and the Aegean Sea to provide any substantial assistance. Fortunately for the Albanian lord, Kruja's garrison, commanded by Tenushtopia, had endured over 2 months of intense Ottoman bombardment and repeated assaults on its walls. Convinced that the fortress could not be taken by force, Mehmed left a token army under Balaban Beda to continue the siege and force a surrender, while he began withdrawing his main army back to Constantinople. Despite his inability to seize Kruja, the Sultan ordered the construction of a formidable fortress known as Elbasan, located in the heart of Albania, as a means to conduct future campaigns in the region. Built in an incredibly short time, reportedly just 25 days, Elbasan demonstrated Mehmed's long-term commitment to subduing the thorn that was the Albanian revolt. While the Ottoman Sultan was marching back home, he received great news of a victory against Venice in the Morea. A 2,000-strong Venetian army besieging Patras had been swept aside and defeated by the forces of Omar Bey in 2 one-sided battles near the coastal town. Over 1,000 invaders were killed, wounded or captured during the chaotic engagements. With Venice beaten back, the Sultan planned to march on Albania the following year. As the winter of 1466 settled in, Skanderbeg visited Italy to gather any assistance for the still besieged Kruja. Despite his desperate pleas, the Albanian leader left Rome with only 5,000 ducats and proceeded to Naples, where he received some weapons, supplies, and an additional 1,000 ducats. Upon his return to his devastated homeland, Skanderbeg began talks with the opportunistic Leke Dugagini to rejoin the Liege of Leisure. After much negotiation, the two sides reached an agreement, and a new host of around 10,000 strong was assembled to relieve Kruja in the spring of 1467. Employing his established tactic of launching multiple coordinated assaults to confuse the Ottoman host, Skanderbeg was able to surround the besiegers under the command of Balaban. After 4 days of hit-and-run attacks on the Turkish camp, the Ottoman Pasha was killed, thus resulting in the fragmentation of his army. Many Turks who had survived the onslaught fled to the surrounding mountains of the Albanian capital, where they were later tracked down and killed in retaliation for the plundering of the region a year prior. Receiving the disastrous news from Albania, Sultan Mehmed II gathered another army to lead personally in an attempt to seize Kruja once more. By the summer of 1467, the Ottoman army had entered the region and again set it ablaze. Many peasants and noblemen were killed and enslaved, as the Sultan's wrath seemed unrelenting against the rebels. In addition to Kruja, the Venetian port town of Durrës was also put under siege by Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha. Regardless, both sieges were to be unsuccessful, as Turkish artillery was not present in either siege. With a plague outbreak hitting the Balkans by August, the Ottoman host withdrew to friendly territory, again failing to achieve their objectives for the campaign. In the months following his victory at Kruja, Skanderbeg began making plans to seize the new Ottoman fortress of Elbasan and expel the Turkish presence from Albania. However, before such plans could be finalized and a council of nobles convened, the Albanian ruler died in January 1468 at the age of 62 from malaria. Skanderbeg was one of the most formidable foes faced by the House of Osman throughout its history. Militarily, the Albanian lord accomplished what few in the Balkans could, sustaining significant resistance against the Ottoman Empire for over 2 decades. From 1443 to 1468, he successfully repelled numerous Ottoman campaigns by employing a combination of guerrilla tactics, strategic fortifications, and a masterful understanding of the rugged Albanian terrain. His leadership in defending key strongholds, particularly the repeated defense of Kruja, earned him a legendary reputation in both the Balkans and Western Europe. Culturally, Skanderbeg came to symbolize the unity and resilience of the Albanian people. In the centuries following his death, particularly during the Albanian national awakening of the 19th century, his figure was revived as a national icon. Although the Albanian revolt would continue after Skanderbeg's death, it effectively became leaderless, as a power struggle erupted in the region. In contrast, Turkish armies became preoccupied with wars elsewhere around the empire. With Skanderbeg dead, Venice defeated at the gates of Patras, and Hungary now engulfed in a bloody war against Bohemia, Sultan Mehmed II set his sights on Anatolia. After a lengthy 40-year reign, Ibrahim II Bey of the Karamanids was bedridden. The late ruler of Konya had 6 sons from his political marriage to Mehmed's late aunt, Elaldi Sultan, with the eldest to youngest being Piri Ahmed, Kasim, Kaya, Nurasufi, Aledin, and Suleiman. However, this marriage alliance between the 2 Turkic houses failed to maintain peace between their realms, as frequent border skirmishes occurred, most famously during the Varna Crusade and before the siege of Constantinople. Loathing his sons with Elaldi because of their Ottoman heritage, Ibrahim instead favoured Ishak, his son born to a concubine in his harem, as his natural successor. This favouritism from their father evidently heightened tensions between Ishak and his more legitimate half-brothers. With Ibrahim II Bey's death in 1464, a power struggle erupted among his sons, prompting Ishak to first flee to the Ramazanids of Cilicia before making his way to the court of Uzun Hasan of the Akkuyunlu. Meanwhile, Suleiman and Nurasufi successfully appealed to Mehmed II for fiefs in Ottoman Anatolia, while Qasim fled to the Mamluks of Egypt, the traditional ally of the Karamanids. Official hostilities erupted between Ibrahim's sons when Ishak, leading an Akkuyunlu army, invaded the Karamanid Beylik and captured Konya. However, this swift triumph did not last long, as Piri Ahmed had escaped to the safety of Constantinople. Appealing to Mehmed to appoint him as a pro-Ottoman Bey of the Karamanids against his openly hostile half-brother, Piri Ahmed led an army into the Beylik in the spring of 1465. Defeating Ishak in open battle near the town of Dapazara, the half-Ottoman, half-Karamanid Bey entered Konya as an official vassal of the Sublime Porte. Despite bending the knee to his cousin, Piri Ahmed conducted secret alliance negotiations with Venice, similar to his late father during the Varna Crusade, to maintain his independence from the Ottomans. Nonetheless, this would prove disastrous, as Mehmed intercepted such talks and invaded the Beylik alongside his Grand Vizier. In a lightning campaign during the summer of 1468, Konya surrendered without a fight, while its bey escaped to the Akkuyunlu. To signify his total victory over a fellow Turkic power, the artisans of the Karamanid capital were rounded up and sent to Constantinople on the Sultan's orders. However, it was during this episode that Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha was dismissed and exiled due to the political maneuvers of the second Vizier, Rum Mehmed Pasha, who took his rival's former office. Allegedly, the former Grand Vizier had accepted bribes from the city's elite artisans in exchange for the safety of their homes and wealth. Whether or not these allegations were factual, after annexing the entirety of the Karamanid Beylik once and for all, Mehmed concluded his campaign during the fall of 1468 and left for his capital. While the Sultan was away in Anatolia, Ottoman raiders from the newly conquered province of Bosnia launched a series of raids on Venetian and Austrian possessions in the Balkans. Under the command of Isa Bey, these incursions reached as far as Sadar and Šibenik in Dalmatia, as well as Metlika and Ljubljana in Carniola. Many market towns and their surrounding villages were torched, and the inhabitants were either massacred or taken as slaves. In retaliation for such devastating raids into Christendom, Venetian forces, led by the military governor of the island of Evia, Niccolo di Canale, struck the coastlines of Ottoman Macedonia and Thrace. These raids resulted in the sacking of Ainos and the killing and enslavement of its Greek population. While Mehmed II spent the winter of 1469 in Sofia due to a devastating plague outbreak in Constantinople, he ordered his fleet to gather in the safety of the Bosphorus. The Sultan planned to launch a surprise invasion of the Venetian island of Evia the following year, intending to deal a significant blow to the Doge's military capabilities in the local region. Deceiving the Venetians into believing his fleet was heading to Rhodes to confront the Knights Hospitaller, Mehmed landed his force of around 35,000 on the island during the summer of 1470. After a month-long siege, the island's fortress capital of Negroponte fell to the Sultan's army, resulting in its sacking and the massacre of its Greek and Latin inhabitants. In the weeks following the fall of Negroponte, the remaining castles of Evia surrendered in fear, bringing the entire island under Ottoman control. However, while the Sultan was preoccupied with his war against Venice, his attention would once again shift to Anatolia, as a new eastern threat arose in the form of the Ak-Koyunlu under Uzun Hasan. The Ak-Koyunlu were one of several Turkoman tribal federations that emerged in the 14th century after the Mongol invasions and the decline of the Ilkhanate. Initially based in eastern Anatolia and parts of Armenia and northern Mesopotamia, the Ak-Koyunlu vied for dominance against their Turkic cousins and rivals, the Kara Koyunlu. By the early 15th century, the state was relatively minor compared to the Kara Koyunlu, who had established a powerful state centered in Tabriz under the rule of Kara Yusuf and his successors. However, the foundations for the Ak-Koyunlu resurgence were laid by Uzun Hasan's grandfather Osman Bey, who began consolidating his power in Diyarbakir with the support of the Timurids during the early 1400s. Uzun Hasan was born in 1423 and succeeded his brother Jahangir Bey as leader of the Ak-Koyunlu in 1452. He quickly proved himself to be a shrewd military and political leader. His early reign was marked by campaigns aimed at strengthening internal control over the Confederation and subduing rival Turkoman tribes in eastern Anatolia. Yet, by the 1460s, the Bey was drawn into a war with the Kara Koyunlu. The climax of Uzun Hasan's campaign came in 1467, when he decisively defeated and killed Jahan Shah at Chapakchur. This victory effectively ended the Kara Koyunlu's dominance and allowed Uzun Hasan to seize their core territories, including the crucial city of Tabriz, which he made his capital. After this victory, Uzun Hasan inherited an expansive and diverse realm that included much of modern-day Iran, Azerbaijan, and Iraq. He began transforming the Ak-Koyunlu tribal federation into a more centralized state and styled himself as Padishah-e Iran. In 1472, tensions in the recently conquered Ottoman province of Karaman erupted when Qasim Bey, the second eldest son of the late Ibrahim II, marched into the region with Mamluk military support. Although he was defeated and routed at the Battle of Mut near the Taurus Mountains, Qasim's sudden rebellion signalled to Mehmed that his eastern borders were under constant threat from the Mamluks and the Ak-Koyunlu. He would be proven right. In a bold and strategic move, Uzun Hasan began forging alliances against the Ottomans, particularly with the Mamluks and more notably with Venice and the papacy, who viewed him as a valuable eastern ally against the growing threat of Mehmed's empire. The two sides attempted to unite their forces against Mehmed during the summer of 1472, when a Christian fleet, composed of Venetian, Papal, Neapolitan and Knights Hospitaller forces, launched a surprise assault on the Ottoman coastal towns of Antalya and Izmir, resulting in the burning of their outer suburbs. Meanwhile, Uzun Hasan officially declared war against the Sublime Porte and crossed into Ottoman eastern Anatolia at the head of a 60,000-strong host, besieging and sacking Tokat. The Ak-Koyunlu Sultan viewed Mehmed as an obstacle to his expansion plans in the Middle East, as he sought to seize a Mediterranean port to commence trading with Europe himself. Therefore, he allied with Western powers, in an attempt to secure Anatolia for himself, much like the once great Emir Timur had done 70 years earlier. In response to the sudden eastern threat to his realm, Mehmed reinstated Mahmud Pasha as Grand Vizier, and began mustering the largest Ottoman host seen since his great siege of Constantinople, consisting of 70 to 100,000 troops. By the fall of 1472, the army was ferried into Anatolia, where it wintered in Bursa. Meanwhile, the local forces of Mehmed's two eldest sons, Shahzada Bayezid, governor of Amasya, and Shahzada Mustafa, governor of Konya, joined near Isparta to fend off the sudden invasion, until reinforcements arrived from the capital. After decades of significant victories in Europe, everything depended on the campaigning season of 1473 for the Ottoman Sultan. Otherwise, it seemed his new empire would crumble with the loss of Anatolia. While Ottoman lands up to Ankara were being sacked, Piri Ahmed and Qasim Bey united their forces and seized Kayseri. The following year, they planned to invade their homeland of Karaman to restore their father's once proud beylik. However, the two brothers were defeated by Shahzada Mustafa at the Battle of Kareli, which forced them to flee to Akkyunlu territory. The decisive battle also resulted in the capture of three of Uzun Hasan's sons, Yusuf Mirza, Zainal Mirza and Omer Mirza. The three brothers were later ransomed back to their father's realm by the end of the year. Additional good news arrived for the Sultan when a Venetian fleet north of Cyprus, carrying ample gunpowder weapons to the Akkyunlu, was ambushed and seized by Ottoman corsairs, a development that would be crucial to the outcome of Mehmed's military campaign to come. By spring 1473, Mehmed began marching east at the head of his immense host. Unlike in previous campaigns, where he kept his actual military dispositions and objectives secret from the world, the Sultan wrote public letters to the Akkyunlu ruler, demanding that their armies clash in eastern Anatolia. Accepting Mehmed's call, Uzun Hasan marched west once more in the summer, commanding a great Turkoman host. By August, the vanguards of the two armies met near Malatya, where the forces of Has Murad Pasha were routed back north to Erzincan. During the retreat north, the Ottoman Pasha, who was the illegitimate nephew of Constantine XI, drowned in the Euphrates River. Upon hearing of the death of one of his favourite statesmen, Mehmed nearly abandoned the campaign, but was persuaded to continue when envoys from Uzun Hasan arrived at his camp near the town of Turchan. The Akkyunlu Sultan had demanded the former territories of the Trebizond Empire, as well as the beyliks of the Karamanids, Areshnids and Jandarids. To make it clear that he possessed the power to enforce his demands, the envoys presented the Sultan with a sack of millet, remarking that if he took arms against their master, his troops would need to be at least as numerous as the grains. The outraged Mehmed responded to this provocation by replying, "Tell your master that as quickly as these chickens have devoured the sack of millet, my janissaries will deal with his men, who may be skilled at herding goats but not at fighting." The battle between the two Turkic sultans was just around the corner. On August 11th, both armies met near the heights of Otluk Beli. The Ottoman host numbered around 100,000 soldiers. Sultan Mehmed II and the Grand Vizier commanded the centre, alongside the Kapikuli Sipahi cavalry, the elite Janissary infantry and artillery. To the left lay the provincial Anatolian army, led by Shahzada Mustafa and Anatolian Beylerbey David Pasha. To the right stood the Romalian army, commanded by the Sultan's eldest son, Shahzada Bayezid. Both flanks comprised Tamalik cavalry, augmented by a vanguard of light Azeb infantry, specialized Tefekci gunners, and Akinji light horsemen on the far wings. The Akkyunlu host had a similar number of troops to the Ottomans, ranging from 70 to 100,000, and was a classical Turkoman army, comprised primarily of light cavalry and spearmen. Uzun Hasan and Piri Ahmed commanded the centre, while the Sultan's sons, Zainal Mirza and Ogulu Mehmed, respectively commanded the right and left flanks. The battle began with the Ottoman Anatolian army charging into Zainal Mirza's ranks. The bloody engagement was one-sided, as the more modern, disciplined and firepower-heavy Ottoman troops overpowered the traditional, fast-moving tribal cavalry of the Akkyunlu. Amid the chaos of the battle and the confusion caused by the rising dust from the ground, Zainal fell from his horse and was killed by an Azab named Mahmud Aga. With the prince's severed head sent back to Mehmed and without a leader, the Akkyunlu right flank began to rout off the battlefield in massive panic, resulting in many casualties. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, Bayezid's army of Romalia had engaged with the forces of Ogulu Mehmed, and once again, the Ottomans outgunned their foes. Knowing the battle was already lost, the Akkyunlu prince began to withdraw from the battlefield, but was captured by Akinjis and taken back to Mehmed. Soon after, the Akkyunlu left flank also began routing en masse. According to classical chronicles, with Ottoman troops now pouring down both his flanks, an enraged Uzun Hasan shouted at Piri Ahmed, "May the Karamanid dynasty be ruined! What quarrels did I even have with the sons of Osman?" With artillery now bombarding his exposed ranks, the Sultan of Akkyunlu and the Karamanid Bey fled the scene of their great defeat. The one-sided Battle of Otluk Beli was over, leaving over 30,000 dead, wounded and captured Turkomans compared to only 1,000 Ottoman casualties. As the dust settled over the plains of Otluk Beli, the fate of eastern Anatolia had been decided. Uzun Hasan's dreams of halting Ottoman expansion were shattered. With them, the rising star of the Akkyunlu began to fade, leading to the gradual decline of the vast empire throughout the remainder of the 15th century. The battle also demonstrated that the highly disciplined gunpowder units of the Sublime Porte massively outperformed the disorganized Turkoman tactics of Asia. For Sultan Mehmed II, Osluk Belli was more than just a military victory. It was a declaration to all rivals in the west and east that his empire was not just here to stay, it was here to dominate. With the Sultan securing his eastern borders, he would now direct his full attention to the European theatre of his empire, where he remained for the rest of his reign. However, Mehmed's military triumphs were dampened when his beloved son, Shahzada Mustafa, fell ill and died the following year, shocking many in the government. The Ottoman prince had been the most promising of Mehmed's three sons, and had been groomed as a potential heir. Outraged by Mustafa's sudden death, the Sultan blamed the tragedy on Mahmud Pasha. The Grand Vizier was first detained and stripped of his titles before being executed, a move that highlighted Mehmed's increasing authoritarianism toward members of his own government. Mahmud's rival, Gedik Ahmed Pasha, may have also played a role in the vizier's rapid downfall, as he was soon hailed as Grand Vizier in 1474. Mahmud Pasha, the Ottoman statesman who loyally and dutifully served the Sultan over 2 decades in various military expeditions in the Balkans and Anatolia, was buried in Constantinople. After Skanderbeg's death back in 1468, the Albanian revolt against the Ottomans had lost its central leader and driving force. The Albanian lord had successfully unified various nobles of his homeland and led a 25-year resistance that kept the Turks at bay through a combination of brilliant military tactics and forming alliances with Western European powers. Nevertheless, with Skanderbeg's death, the Albanian nobility lacked a unifying figure to lead its armies. Skanderbeg's son, John II Kastrioti, was too young and inexperienced to assume leadership, and none of the surviving noble families commanded the same respect or allegiance from the broader Albanian population. Nevertheless, local resistance efforts continued in the region, with limited Venetian backing from the Doge's strongholds in Shkodra, Durrës and Lezhë. While Sultan Mehmed spent much of 1474 in his imperial palace due to recurring gout, he dispatched an army to the west to address the ongoing Albanian revolt. After being unable to capture Durrës back in 1467, the Sultan tasked Hadim Suleiman Pasha with besieging Shkodra to cut off aid to Albania from the north. Leading a provisional army of over 20,000, the Romalian Beyler Bey marched across the Balkans in the spring and laid siege to the Venetian stronghold by mid-May. Although its walls crumbled under heavy Ottoman artillery fire, the local garrison managed to hold out for several months. In the final assault in August alone, the Turkish forces suffered 3,000 casualties. As his losses mounted and news of a Christian fleet approaching to relieve the siege arrived, the Ottoman Pasha withdrew his army from Shkodra to the great jubilation of the Venetians. However, instead of returning to the imperial capital, Suleiman received new orders from Mehmed II to muster a fresh army and march towards the Danube, as a new threat arose in the distant lands of Moldavia. Like its sister state of Wallachia, the Principality of Moldavia was founded in the mid-14th century amid the decline of Mongol dominance in Eastern Europe and the weakening of the Kingdom of Hungary's eastern frontier. Around 1345, Dragos of Maramuresh, a Vlach noble, was sent by the Hungarian crown to establish a border march against Tatar incursions in the east. He succeeded in creating a realm, marking the beginning of Moldavia as a political entity. Soon after Dragos's death, his successors were expelled by Bogdan I, a rival voivode who had rebelled against Hungarian authority and asserted Moldavian independence around 1359. Under him and his successors, Moldavia evolved into a principality with its own institutions, military and royal dynasty. The realm's territory stretched between the Carpathians and the Dniester River, encompassing key trade routes to the Black Sea. Nevertheless, by the late 14th century, Moldavia was forced to contend with the influences of Hungary, Poland and the rising Ottomans, all of whom coveted its vital Black Sea port towns of Akerman and Kilia. Much like Wallachia, the principality served as a crucial buffer state for all three during the 15th century. By 1451, Bogdan II of Moldavia was murdered and usurped by his brother Peter III, who became an official vassal of Poland while also paying an annual tribute to the Ottomans. However, Bogdan's son, Stephen, received support from the Hungarian armies of John Hunyadi. Along with his cousin, Vlad III Dracula, he reclaimed the throne from his relative by 1457. The new ruler continued to pay tribute to the Ottomans and used the peace to reform his realm. He expanded and professionalized the army, creating a standing force of mercenaries and enhancing the mobilization of peasant levies. The power of the Vlach nobility was also curtailed, as new judicial laws and tax codes were enacted to promote central control from the capital of Suceava. In 1462, the opportunistic Stefan III supported Ottoman armies during their war against Wallachia to recapture Kilia. This goal was achieved by 1465, allowing Stefan to gain control over the strategic Danube delta. Observing that Moldavia was beginning to re-establish itself as a regional player under their ambitious ruler, the King of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, invaded the country in 1467. There, the Hungarian monarch faced a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Baia, losing up to 10,000 men and sustaining injuries himself. The victorious Stefan followed up on his significant triumph by raiding Transylvania and thwarting a Great Horde invasion at Lipnitz over the next 4 years. It was also during this period that his former exiled rival, Peter III, attempted to seize the Moldavian throne alongside the forces of Radu III of Wallachia. Ultimately, both attempts were unsuccessful. By the early 1470s, the relationship between Mehmed II and Stefan had begun to deteriorate, as the Sultan insisted that Kilia be returned to Wallachian control. While Ottoman armies were engaged in Anatolia against Uzun Hasan, Stefan III terminated his tributary status with the Sublime Porte and invaded Wallachia in the fall of 1473. The strongly pro-Ottoman Radu III was defeated in battle and replaced by his Daneshti relative Basarab III. However, by the end of the year, Radu reclaimed his throne with the support of Mihalolu Ali Bey and 17,000 Akinji raiders, who plundered the local countryside as the new year approached. Yet the reign of the Impaler's brother was not destined to last long, as by the spring of 1474, Basarab regained power once again with Moldavian assistance. With Wallachian politics once again in turmoil and the loyal Radu III deposed, Mehmed sent Stefan an ultimatum. The Moldavian king would either pay his annual tribute, pay homage to the Sultan in Constantinople, and cede Kilia to the empire immediately, or face the wrath of the Ottoman armies. By the summer of 1474, the Sultan received his response from the Moldavian voivode, a staggering refusal of all conditions. Shortly thereafter, official war was declared, and orders were sent to Hadim Suleiman Pasha to march on Moldavia. The Rumelian Beyler Bey spent the rest of the year gathering reinforcements for his war-weary army in Sofia. Although it was long past the campaigning season, Suleiman managed to assemble around 30,000 to 40,000 troops for the Moldavian War. This provincial force consisted of Azebs, Janissaries, Akinjis, Tamali Sipahi heavy cavalry, and a number of Bulgarian engineers, tasked with clearing out roads and bridges of the local region. With Turkish troops gathering so close to his borders, Basarab III reverted his realm's status to that of an Ottoman vassal, and also pledged a contingent of Wallachian cavalry for Suleiman's war effort. As a result, the pathway into Moldavia was opened to the Ottomans. Meanwhile, Stefan was able to gather around 20,000 troops for the upcoming war. Half of his army consisted of peasant conscripts, mobilized from the countryside, and the regular Moldavian army, which included professional infantry, light and heavy boyar cavalry, and 20 cannons. The other half of the army consisted of foreign auxiliaries and mercenaries from neighboring Christian kingdoms, including 5,000 CK infantry, 2,000 Polish cavalry, 1,800 Hungarian infantry, cavalry and handgunners, and lastly 1,000 Wallachian volunteers. By November 1474, Suleiman began crossing the frozen Danube in 2 columns from Vidin and Nicopolis. Regardless, the weather had already turned for the worse, slowing the Ottoman host's march north. Recognizing that his men were cold and exhausted, Suleiman rested his troops for over 2 weeks near Bucharest, where he received reinforcements from Basarab's promised contingent of 10,000 Wallachians. By December, the Turkish forces entered Moldavia, but Stefan was prepared and utilized scorched earth tactics to confront the invaders. Hundreds of villages were burned, their wells poisoned, and their local inhabitants relocated to create supply issues for the far more numerous Ottoman army. This was a war of attrition, and Stefan was accustomed to battling superior opponents, continually harassing the Ottomans with his hit-and-run tactics, reminiscent of those employed by his cousin Vlad the Impaler. After nearly a month of marching through the abandoned countryside in freezing conditions, Turkish scouts sighted a few dozen intact villages in a valley where the Barlat River flows south of the town of Vaslui. With heavy fog, rain and frigid temperatures plaguing his men, Suleiman decided to rest his army in the supply-rich region before continuing his march northward to the Moldavian capital. However, as the Ottoman troops began to cross the river over the only bridge in the area, Moldavian battle drums were heard in the north. Convinced that Stefan's entire army was ahead, Suleiman hastily advanced his troops through the dense fog and ordered the army to assemble on the western side of the river. As the drum roll continued, more Ottoman soldiers crossed the river and moved through the marshes to the north, forming a makeshift battle formation. Regardless, this brought the exhausted and now panicked Turkish host into a narrow valley, from which showers of arrows rained upon them. Situated at the end of the marshland was the Moldavian army, fortified behind earthworks and trenches. As the Ottoman front lines finally came into contact with Stefan's regular army and troops from Poland, Hungary and Transylvania, a bloody hand-to-hand melee ensued over the highly fortified positions on the marshland. Hearing the news of the struggle, Suleiman Pasha, stationed at the rear of the army and unable to assess the situation on the front lines, ordered a general advance and began rushing men across the small wooden bridge. Unbeknownst to him, he had just led his army into a trap. As reinforcements crossed the river, Moldavian cannon fire and barrages from the handgunners had begun to bombard the Turkish host from the opposite side of the river. The now panicked Suleiman began rushing his heavy cavalry across the wooden bridge, and this, combined with cannon fire, ultimately caused the unsturdy bridge to collapse. While Turkish reinforcements now attempted to cross the freezing cold river, the Wallachian contingent refused to do so, leading to significant tensions within the Ottoman army mid-battle. A fierce war of words caused Basarab to withdraw his support for Suleiman, thereby initiating his withdrawal from the battle. Meanwhile, back on the front lines, the Ottoman Sipahis were successful in pushing the left wing of the Sikeas and the Moldavian professionals. However, this lured the army further into the grasp of Stefan. Suddenly, the Moldavian war drums were heard from the forest to the left of the Ottoman line. Completely exposed, Ottoman officers panicked. Having never been made fully aware of the tactical situation, Suleiman tried to form a secondary line to defend against the threat on his left side. Nevertheless, the main Moldavian attack was planned against the Ottoman right flank, and the heavy boyar cavalry of Stefan, which had been hidden behind a forested hill until then, charged into the rear and flank of the Ottoman host. Despite still outnumbering their opponents, the now exhausted Turkish host thought that they were surrounded from three sides and began routing en masse. The battle had now turned into a massacre, in which individual Ottoman units fled the battlefield in all directions. During the three-day Great Retreat, the remains of Suleiman's host were run down by Moldavian cavalry, resulting in many Ottoman officers being taken captive and then executed. The Battle of Vaslui would become one of the most significant defeats in Ottoman history. The Sublime Porte suffered up to 20,000 casualties during the battle, compared to Stefan's 5,000. Like Skanderbeg before him, the Moldavian ruler was anointed by the Pope with the title of Athletic Christi for his great victory over the Turks. However, such a victory was to be celebrated only briefly, as in the following months after the battle, Stefan would conclude an alliance with Hungary, knowing that Mehmed's wrath would soon be at the gates of his realm. By the spring of 1476, Sultan Mehmed had recovered from his bout of gout and planned to personally march on Moldavia to take revenge for the Battle of Vaslui. Like Germanicus avenging the fallen Roman legions at the Teutoburg forest, the Ottoman Sultan aimed to restore the honor of his armies in the upcoming war. Gathering a force of 40,000 in Sofia, the Sultan marched along the Black Sea coast and reached the Danube in early summer. While it took the army over 3 days to cross the Great River, Mehmed's Tatar allies from Crimea also invaded Moldavia from the east. Nevertheless, they were routed near Akerman by Stefan's forces and pushed out of the country entirely, thus thwarting Mehmed's plan to open a second front in the war. Like a year and a half earlier, the Moldavian voivode intended to employ scorched earth tactics and attrition warfare against a numerically superior foe. However, Mehmed did not repeat the mistakes of the previous expedition and marched cautiously through the region to ensure the safety of his supply lines. As the Ottoman army advanced towards Suceava through the White Valley, also known as Valea Alba, they finally encountered Stephen's host of 12,000. The Turkish vanguard, led by none other than Hadim Suleiman Pasha himself, was ambushed by the Moldavian ruler and suffered heavy losses. It was only with the arrival of the main Ottoman army that the Rumelian Beylerbey's contingent was saved, forcing Stephen to retreat to his camp. Due to the fact that he had not been reinforced with troops from Poland and Hungary, as had been the case the previous year, the voivode decided to go on the defensive and allow the invaders to attack his fortified line, which was located behind a forest. The next day, Mehmed ordered a general advance of his army, but this resulted in a great blunder, as the forest through which the army passed was set ablaze by the Moldavians, resulting in many casualties to the Ottoman host. During this panic, the army was also showered with incoming fire from Moldavian handgunners and artillery from ahead. It was only when the Sultan arrived on the front lines and rallied his officers and janissaries that morale in the Ottoman army resurged. Now being overwhelmed by his opponent's numbers on all sides, Stephen withdrew his host from the battlefield in order to prepare for the siege of his capital. Although Mehmed had secured a victory at the Battle of Valea Alba, it had come at a heavy cost. Between 5,000 and 10,000 Ottomans had been killed or wounded during the course of the battle, compared to only around 1,000 Moldavians. Due to these high losses and plague now roaming the local countryside, the Sultan was unable to follow up on his victory over Stephen, who had fled to the Polish border to reassemble his strength. Unable to seize the primary fortresses of the region, such as Kilia, Akerman and Suceava, Mehmed concluded his campaign by the end of the summer, but not before ravaging the entirety of Moldavia. Although now left in ruins, Stephen's realm managed to survive Mehmed's onslaught and maintain its independence. With Ottoman armies now gone from the local region, King Matthias ordered his vassal, Stephen Batory of Transylvania, to invade Wallachia alongside the Moldavians to restore Vlad to his throne. By the fall of 1476, Basarab III had lost his throne once again. However, in a demonstration of the volatility of Wallachian politics, he managed to regain power by the start of 1477 with Ottoman support. During this struggle, Vlad was cornered at the town of Snegov and was beheaded by Turkish agents. The head of the Impaler Prince was soon sent to Mehmed, where it was placed upon a high stake for all to see in the imperial capital. 15 years after his initial campaign of terror in the Balkans, Vlad III Dracula had finally been defeated and killed, representing a significant propaganda victory for Sultan Mehmed II. With Wallachia secured and Moldavia on the back foot, Mehmed now turned his gaze to his wars elsewhere in the Balkans. Since the Ottoman conquest of Serbia and Bosnia, the Turkish marcher lords of the Balkans gradually intensified their raids deep into Europe. In 1474, Mihalolu Ali Bey had launched a significant raid into Hungary. He reached as far as Oradea, enslaving and looting as he progressed through the country. Later that year, Turkish raiders from Bosnia also invaded Croatia, extending as far as Varaždin, Metlika and Batui. By the time of the disaster at Vaslui, Ottoman raiders had penetrated into the border regions of Carniola and Carinthia, causing significant panic in the royal courts of both Hungary and Austria. Due to these devastating incursions into his realm, Matthias Corvinus pledged support for Stephen's war effort against Mehmed. Pausing his campaign in Bohemia, the Hungarian king gathered an army of 10,000 and marched on the recently constructed Ottoman fortress of Shabatz in the fall of 1475. By the start of the new year, the fortress was besieged with the assistance of the titular despot of Serbia, Vuk Gregorović, the grandson of Juraj Branković. After 30 days, Shabatz fell to the invaders, thus further securing the hinterland surrounding Belgrade from additional Ottoman incursions across the Danube. In the weeks following the siege, Hungarian raids into Turkish-controlled Bosnia and Serbia commenced. This included the looting of many towns by none other than a newly released Vlad Dracula. As he had done over a decade ago, the former Wallachian voivode impaled and massacred soldiers and civilians alike during yet another campaign of terror. In retaliation for the fall of Shabatz, the Ottoman marcher lords of Serbia resumed their destructive raids into Hungary throughout the summer of 1476, overrunning the Banat of Temeshvar. However, the force was to be defeated at the town of Bela Kirkva during their journey back to friendly territory. Further raids into Croatia and Slovenia were also initiated, with the sacking of towns such as Grk, Vipava, Postojna and Ljubljana. By the end of the year, Ottoman raids had extended as far as Tavisio, Arnoldstein and Villach, as peasant revolts erupted in the broader region. The situation was so dire that King Matthias's bride, Princess Beatrice of Naples, had to navigate her way into her future husband's plundered kingdom through charred villages and fields of corpses, while desperately trying to avoid Turkish raiders. In the twilight years of his reign, Mehmed II began focusing on consolidating his power in the outer regions of his empire. After years of fighting on multiple fronts within his realm, the Sultan sought to stabilize his frontiers, while formulating new plans to expand westward toward the heart of Europe. The first region we will examine is the Black Sea, which the Sultan aimed to transform into an Ottoman lake. Nonetheless, many powers perched on the Black Sea coast would challenge these ambitions, including the principalities of Moldavia and Theodoro, along with the Genoese colonies of Kaffa, Kerch and Tana, and the Crimean Khanate. To fully understand the political situation, we must first turn back the clock. The Golden Horde was one of the major successor states of the Mongol Empire, emerging in the mid-13th century under the leadership of Batu Khan, a grandson of the great Genghis Khan. The Khanate dominated an expansive territory that stretched from the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River in the west to the edges of Siberia in the east. Feared by various foes, the Golden Horde famously raided Eastern Europe for centuries, often extracting tribute to support its war machine, particularly from the minor Russian principalities to its north. In addition to being a significant military power, the Khanate played a prominent role in the Eurasian trade network. Situated at a crossroads between east and west, the state facilitated commerce along the Silk Road by providing protection to caravans and maintaining a stable system of weights and coinage. Cities like Sarai became bustling trade hubs, where goods from China, the Middle East, India and Western Europe exchanged hands. This prosperity contributed to the cosmopolitan nature of the nomadic Khanate, attracting merchants, scholars and artisans from diverse cultural backgrounds. By the early 14th century, the Golden Horde had abandoned its ancestral religion of Tengriism in favor of Islam under its ruler Uzbek Khan, linking the state to the broader Islamic world. However, following Uzbek's death, the state experienced dynastic instability and a rise in independence movements among its local governors and generals. With the authority of the Ulugh Khan compromised, the Golden Horde faced a series of significant military defeats against its northern neighbors by the second half of the century. Although the military and diplomatic situation somewhat stabilized during the reign of Toktamish Khan in the 1380s, Timur's invasion of the Khanate in the 1390s shattered any real chance for the state's recovery. Fragmenting like the Mongol Empire, the Golden Horde, now referred to as the Great Horde, was reduced to just the core lands surrounding its central capital of Sarai, also known as the Ulugh Yurd. In the early 1440s, a warlord named Haji I Giray established a newly independent Tatar-led state in the fertile peninsula of Crimea and claimed the contested title of Ulugh Khan. Tracing their lineage back to the great Genghis Khan's grandson, Tugay Timur, the Giray family aimed to reclaim the entirety of the former territories of the Golden Horde. In this quest for legitimacy, they confronted the Great Horde, and later the Khanate of Kazan further north. During the ensuing wars, the Giray family allied with the Grand Duke of Muscovy, while the Joji family partnered with Lithuania. Yet this balance between the two sides shifted with Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople in 1453, which expanded his realm's influence over the Black Sea. Aligning himself with the growing power of the Sublime Porte, Haji I supported its military campaigns against the Genoese over the next 2 decades. With the death of Haji in 1466, a civil war erupted in the Crimean Khanate between the two sons of the former ruler, Nur-Devlet and Mienli. In their struggle for the throne, the elder Nur allied himself with Muscovy and the Great Horde, while the younger Mienli sought military assistance from the Tatar elites of the Crimean Peninsula and the Ottomans. After 2 years of conflict, Mienli had secured the throne, while his defeated brother was imprisoned in the Genoese fortress of Sudak. Although the Khanate appeared united once more, it faced another wave of instability in 1475. For many years, local Tatar governors, known as Tuduns, had been granted authority to govern the Muslim population of Kaffa and its surrounding lands by the Crimean Khan and the local Genoese consul of the city. However, after a dispute over filling the vacant office between the Khan and the Genoese, the Tatar elites of the Crimean Peninsula sought Ottoman intervention to resolve the issue. Among these elites was the influential Emenek of the Shirin clan, who by the beginning of the year had driven Mengle Garai from his capital of Kirkyur, forcing the Khan to flee to the safety of the Genoese at Kaffa. Seeing an opportunity to expand his influence across the broader Black Sea region and restore order in Crimea, Mehmed II eagerly accepted the invitation and ordered Gedik Ahmed Pasha to set sail for the region in the spring of 1475. The Ottoman Grand Vizier led a large navy to Kaffa and besieged the Genoese settlement. Kaffa could only resist the invaders for 4 days, as the intense Ottoman bombardment proved too much for its defenders to withstand. With the Genoese consul executed and Mienli captured, Ahmed Pasha turned his attention to the remaining fortresses that were still resisting in the region. Like Kaffa, the fortress of Sudak fell to Turkish forces after a brief siege, which also led to the capture of Nurdevlet. The fall of these settlements was followed by the annexation of Kerch and Tana later in the year, thus ending the Genoese presence in the Black Sea. The notable fortress of Theodoro, located in the interior countryside under local Greek rule, was also besieged to eradicate the last vestiges of Christian power in Crimea. The Principality of Theodoro, also known as Gothia, was a small Christian state that traced its origins to the Empire of Trebizond, making it the last remnant of Eastern Roman civilization. Economically, Theodoro was deeply involved in regional trade. Although it lacked a significant port of its own, it maintained overland routes connecting to Genoese-controlled ports, such as Kaffa and Sadak. These trade connections helped Theodoro remain economically viable, despite its political vulnerability. Influenced by Greek, Gothic, and local Crimean cultures, the Gabras family governed from their capital at Theodoro and maintained autonomy through close diplomatic relations with their more powerful neighbours. With Ottoman armies now at his gates, Prince Alexander Gabras prepared his capital for a brutal siege. Theodoro was ideally suited for defence, as it sat atop a steep limestone plateau, more than 1,000 feet above the surrounding plains, and was fortified with massive stone walls, towers, and natural cliffs that made a direct assault exceedingly difficult. It had successfully resisted attacks from the Tartars and Genoese in the past, and the defenders likely believed they could withstand another onslaught. However, Ahmed Pasha brought artillery and siege engineers with him, many of whom had been present in Constantinople during the 1453 siege. Even with this development, as well as limited supplies and foreign support, Alexander was able to hold out longer than even Constantine XI himself. For over 3 months, Turkish guns bombarded the capital, but were unable to penetrate the limestone plateau. Despite their courage and determination, the exhausted defenders of Theodoro were vastly outnumbered, and morale dwindled as food and water supplies ran low. By December 1475, the Ottomans had captured the city, either by breaching its defences or through a false retreat and ambush. Theodoro fell, and with it, the last vestige of Eastern Rome. With Christian power in Crimea coming to an end, Mehmed reinstated Nurdevlet, but within a year of his return, his realm was invaded by the Great Horde. Although the invasion was repelled, the Crimean elites wrote to Sultan Mehmed requesting his deposition and the reinstatement of Mienli to the Crimean throne. By 1478, Mienli was released from captivity and regained the throne, but this time as an official vassal of the Sublime Porte. With Nurdevlet fleeing to Muscovy, the Crimean Khanate was once again united under a single Khan, who now ruled as the Ottoman Sultan's appointee. In a single military campaign, Mehmed's northern border was secured from enemies, as Moldavia was also compelled to make peace with Constantinople by becoming a tributary to the House of Osman in 1480. Consolidating his power to the north, Mehmed II turned his attention to the wars with Venice and Albania to the west. Consequently, Turkish raiders once again penetrated deep into Europe. In 1476, the Venetian territory of Istria was set ablaze, and its population was taken into slavery. The following year, Omar Bey's raiders advanced into Venetian-held Friuli, where they defeated a local force near the Isonzo River and captured dozens of its officers. In the aftermath of the battle, the lands between the Piave and Isonzo rivers were pillaged and burned, with flames visible from the top of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. Muslim forces possibly have never ventured so deep into the lands of Christendom, which sparked panic all across Europe. In 1478, another raid into the wider region was carried out, this time by Mihalolu Ali Bey and Malkoçoğlu Bali Bey. The two Ottoman marcher lords continued the successes of the previous year by sacking the towns of Bavek, Tolmino, Kobarid, Versine and Valek. While his marcher lords were active deep inside Europe, Mehmed II began preparing for yet another military campaign, this time targeting Albania and its Venetian-held towns. The primary objective was the town of Shkodra, which had been besieged in 1474, along with the Albanian capital of Kruja. By 1478, the once formidable armies of the League of Leisure had dissolved due to a lack of unity under Albanian leadership. Additionally, Kruja had also been virtually surrendered to the Doge. Already blockaded for over a year by local Ottoman forces, the starving garrison of the fortress capitulated when the Sultan's 30,000-strong army appeared beneath its walls during the summer. With the anticlimactic surrender of the capital of Kruja came the conclusion of the formal Albanian revolt, which had initially ignited almost a quarter of a century earlier in the very streets where Mehmed now paraded his army. The bleeding ulcer that had drained the armies of the Sublime Porte had finally been vanquished. With Islamic banners now flying over Kruja, Mehmed's forces marched towards Shkodra, which was already under siege by Rumelian Beylerbey David Pasha. However, unlike the former Albanian capital, the Venetian stronghold proved to be a greater challenge for the Sultan. For many months, the defenders held out against a barrage of artillery fire. Reinforcements from Anatolia were also unable to alter the course of the bloody and prolonged siege. As winter approached, Mehmed and his main forces retreated, while Evrenisolu Ahmet Bey remained with a token force of 10,000. Exhausted after years of war with the Sublime Porte and with Shkodra on the brink of surrender, Venice was determined to end the disastrous conflict at any cost. At the end of 1478, Giovanni Dario, the secretary of the Doge's Senate, was granted unlimited powers to negotiate peace with Mehmed and accept all the demands of the Grand Turk. The terms outlined in the Treaty of Constantinople would prove disastrous for Venice. The Doge was to cede Shkodra, the island of Lemnos, and the mountainous region of Minor to the Porte. Moreover, Venice was to relinquish all claims to Kruja and Negroponte. All territories acquired by Venice during 16 years of warfare were to be returned, while Mehmed, in turn, was to restore all towns and territories he had occupied in the Morea, Albania, and Dalmatia. Lastly, Venice was to pay a grand installment of 150,000 golden ducats over the subsequent 2 years, with an additional 10,000 ducats as the new annual tribute for securing trading rights within Ottoman territory. With Venice securing an expensive peace for itself, the last remnants of resistance in the Balkans against the Ottomans were left to their own devices. The remote lands of the Despotate of Epirus, under the rule of Leonardo III Tocco, had been stripped away by the armies of the Sultan. In 1449, the capital of Arta fell, followed by Anglo-Castron in 1460 to Turkish raiders. The Ottoman-Venetian War of the next 2 decades had been an opportunity for Leonardo to regain these lost lands, and so he decided to align himself with the Doge. Nevertheless, with the end of the war, Epirus now lay open to an easy conquest, as Mehmed wished to use its domains for his future plans against Western Europe. In 1479, Gedik Ahmet Pasha invaded the Despotate at the head of a large fleet and captured its capital of Vonitsa, along with the islands of Lefkada, Cephalonia, and Zakynthos. As a result of the sudden Turkish invasion, Leonardo and his officials fled to Taranto, thus officially putting an end to the Despotate. With all of Albania now under his direct control and peace with Venice secured, Mehmed II began preparations for a new offensive aimed at Western Europe. Nonetheless, before he could proceed, the Sultan had to confront one last front against a foe he had yet to defeat, the Kingdom of Hungary. By the summer of 1479, Ottoman raiders had resumed their attacks and pillaging of King Matthias Corvinus's lands. In swift and brutal assaults, the towns of Nedelice and Luteme were set ablaze, along with the fields and villages along the Drava River. Despite the devastation, these incursions were merely the beginning of a significant Ottoman offensive into the region, as in the town of Smederevo, a grand Turkish force was being assembled. With a total strength of approximately 15 to 25,000 men, the army, led by Mihalolu Ali Bey, crossed the Danube from Vidin, where they were joined by 2,000 allied Wallachians led by Basarab IV. The Wallachian voivode had usurped his cousin, Basarab III, 2 years prior, with the help of Stefan of Moldavia. but had since then knelt to Ottoman vassalage. After the two armies merged, Ali Bey set his sights on the lands of Transylvania, with the objective of seizing the rich deposits of gold, silver and salt in the local region. However, the main Ottoman objective of the campaign was to consolidate their influence south of the Carpathians, thereby preventing Hungarian intervention in Wallachian politics, as had been done after the Battle of Velea Alba 3 years prior. By the fall of 1479, the Ottoman army was on the move. As they plundered their way to the town of Oreshti, Ali's men filled their wagons with abundant spoils and captives. However, as he was preparing to start his return march to Wallachia, the Ottoman marcher lord heard news of an incoming enemy host, and so prepared to make a stand at the town of Shibot. By October 13th, Voivode Stefan Batory of Transylvania, leading a host of 25 to 30,000, composed of Hungarians, Romanians, Transylvanians and Serbs, arrived at the gates of the Turkish camp, situated on the plain of Breadfield near Shibot. Seeing the foe across the plain, Ali Bey marched out with the army and began preparing for battle. The Battle of Breadfield had just begun. The Ottoman army was predominantly composed of light Akinjer cavalry, accompanied by their Wallachian allies, led by Basarab IV in the rear. The centre was commanded by Hasanoğlu İsa Bey, the left by Makacholu Bali Bey, and the right by the leader of the entire army, Mihalolu Ali Bey. On the Hungarian side, Voivode Batory commanded from the centre of his army, which consisted of his retinue of 8,000 Transylvanian infantry and cavalry, as well as a small contingent of Wallachians, led by the deposed and revenge-seeking Basarab III. On the left flank were stationed 10,000 Hungarians, led by Paul Knizi, who was accompanied by Székely light infantry in the rearguard. On the right flank were stationed the Transylvanian Saxon troops, led by Georg Hecht, comprising 4,300 infantry and 700 light cavalry. Accompanying them were 900 light Serb cavalry, led by Despot Vuk Grigorović and Dimitar Jakšić. After a series of inspiring speeches from the leaders of both armies, the battle began when Hecht charged into the Ottoman left. However, after much bloody melee and taking heavy casualties, the Saxons and their Serbian and Romanian allies were forced to retreat, as Bali Bey's horse riders proved too great a challenge to overcome. Meanwhile, another bloody melee between Batory and the Ottoman centre of İsa Bey took place. But during the heavy fighting, the voivode's horse was killed under him, thus severely wounding his thigh. With their commander taken out of action and the Turks breaching their lines, it seemed like all was lost. Despite the circumstances, Batory returned to the battlefield, an action later celebrated by European chroniclers. He began making desperate efforts to counterattack and push back the Ottoman advances on his centre and right. A long melee continued, as many from both sides fell on the plain of Breadfield, where the sounds of swords and screams echoed throughout the battlefield. It was during this critical counterattack that İsa Bey was knocked off his horse and killed, causing a great panic in the Turkish army, resulting in their rout. Now the army of Ali Bey watched in confusion and horror as they too began retreating down south, seeing that the day was lost. With the Ottoman right now withdrawn from the battle, Paul Knizi's Hungarians and Székely infantry surged forward and began circling around the now collapsing Ottoman centre. Many Akinjirs were killed in this charge, which saw the Turkish camp plundered and captured slaves freed. After 5 grueling hours of combat, the Battle of Breadfield came to a bloody close. While Batory's army had lost well over 3,000 men during the battle, around half of the Turkish host lay dead, wounded, or captured alongside their plunder. Like Hunyadi's famous defense of Belgrade back in 1456, the victory at Breadfield was celebrated throughout Hungary and wider Europe, and it marked a rare occasion in which the Ottoman army was defeated in battle. However, while the remnants of Ali Bey's shattered army regrouped in Wallachia, new pressing matters had emerged back in the Ottoman capital. Breadfield was a significant setback to Turkish expansion in the Balkans, but Mehmed's true ambitions lay across the Adriatic in Italy. Since the famous conquest of Constantinople, the Sultan had always eyed the lands where the Roman state was born. According to him, the new red apple was ready to be plucked, just as the old red apple had been back in 1453. By 1480, the Ottoman Empire had finally achieved relative peace after nearly 30 years of continuous warfare. Since his youth, Sultan Mehmed II had removed all threats to his realm one by one, Venice, Moldavia, and the Akkuyunlu were defeated in open war and forced to sign humiliating peace treaties with the Sublime Porte. Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, the Karamanids, and the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire were conquered, and their peoples were incorporated into the larger Ottoman Empire. Lastly, Wallachia, the Crimean Khanate, Ragusa, and Herzegovina were brought into imperial vassalage and made to pay an annual tribute to Constantinople. However, the peaceful period of 1480 did not satisfy Mehmed, who had been secretly seeking new targets to expand his already vast borders. True to his relentless and stubborn nature, the Turkish Caesar planned to launch the most ambitious military campaign in his country's history. But to do so, he had one final target nearer to home. Recognizing its importance in projecting power across the wider region, especially in asserting naval dominance, the Sultan set his sights on the major Mediterranean island of Rhodes. The Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, also known as the Knights Hospitaller, was a Catholic military order founded in 1113, tasked with defending holy shrines across the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The order fought in the Levant against various Islamic enemies over the course of several decades. It gained fame for its military achievements until the fall of the last Crusader stronghold, Acre, to the Mamluks in 1291. Although their lordship had fallen, the order would reinvent itself in the years ahead. Displaced from the Holy Land, the Hospitallers regrouped in the Kingdom of Cyprus and spent the next 2 decades in exile, before capturing the island of Rhodes from the Byzantines in 1309. From their new island base, the order committed to fighting infidels and to drive the Muslim corsairs from the coasts and seas of the Christians. The Knights Hospitallers took part in the battles of Kosovo and Nicopolis, as well as numerous attacks on the Sultan's ships in the Aegean over the decades. However, while the Turks were busy with the Crusade of Varna, the Hospitallers were unable to capitalize on the military situation, as they were repulsing an invasion by the Mamluks of Egypt that same year. After the fall of Constantinople, Rhodes' fortifications were reinforced with new ramparts, towers and ditches, as Ottoman ships began probing the area. This would prove crucial for the order's survival in the years ahead. By 1476, the nearby Hospitaller islands of Simi and Kos were attacked by Turkish raiders, followed the next year by an attack on the town of Archangelos on the main island. After the Ottoman-Venetian War ended in 1479, local Ottoman Sipahi contingents from Anatolia also arrived on Rhodes. They laid siege to the main city for 3 months, setting the countryside ablaze. Although the invaders were eventually pushed back, tensions between the courts of Rhodes and Constantinople increased by year's end, as Mehmed decided to finally end the order that had been a thorn in his realm's side for nearly a century. Grand Admiral Messi Pasha prepared a large army to take Rhodes once and for all the following spring. Wintering at Marmaris on the Anatolian coast, the Byzantine-turned-Ottoman vizier assembled a fleet of over 100 ships and 20,000 soldiers for his invasion. On the morning of May 23, 1480, the Ottoman fleet was seen from Rhodes, shocking and terrifying the island's residents. Only a small force of 1,900 militia and 600 elite knights was stationed in the city's fortress, under the command of Grand Master Pierre d'Aubusson. Anchoring and disembarking from the Bay of Trieste, the Ottoman army marched towards the slope of Mount St. Stephen and set up a headquarters overlooking the land walls. The next day, the city was surrounded by land and sea, with cannons firing at the capital from all directions. Along with the land army were 3 large bronze basilica cannons, similar to those used during the Siege of Constantinople 27 years earlier. The initial goal was to capture the Tower of St. Nicholas at the entrance of the Mandraki harbour, where most of the Order's military fleet was anchored. Securing this key tower would enable the Ottoman fleet to sail into the harbour and overpower the already panicked and outnumbered defenders of Rhodes. After weeks of heavy bombardment, the west-facing wall of the tower collapsed after taking 300 cannonballs to its base. On June 4th, the first attack on the collapsed wall was launched, but was repelled by a group of knights led by Fabrizio del Carretto. In the following days, hundreds of residents worked tirelessly to repair the tower amid heavy cannon fire. With the defenders desperately holding out against the Ottoman war machine, good news arrived for Pierre d'Aubusson in the form of a Sicilian cargo ship. The vessel had managed to slip through the besieging Turkish fleet, carrying vital grain and 100 volunteers ready to defend the city. After 2 more attacks on the Tower of St. Nicholas were repelled in early June, an increasingly anxious Messi Pasha turned to the southern land walls, which were older and thus considered more vulnerable than the northern sea walls. The southern towers of England, Provence and Italy were subjected to bombardment, while pressure on the Tower of St. Nicholas intensified, stretching the defenders thin on all sides. With Ottoman artillery becoming more effective than in recent weeks, D'Aubusson ordered a secondary defensive line and ditch to be built behind the southern walls in the Jewish quarter of the city to prepare for a possible breach. Meanwhile, Ottoman engineers started digging a complex network of trenches leading up to the moat in front of the land walls. At night, they transported carts filled with rubble and dumped them into the moat to raise its level. To buy more time, D'Aubusson commanded his miners to tunnel beneath the land walls, bringing rubble from inside the moat back into the city under cover of darkness. Come morning, the besiegers were confused to find that their night's work had been undone. While progress was being made in the south, pressure on the Tower of St. Nicholas was intensifying. Between June 13th and 18th, a furious bombardment took place on the tower, while a great pontoon bridge was constructed, which was long enough to reach from the shoreline to the mole of the harbour. On the night of the 18th, Janissaries carrying ladders and hook ropes assaulted the mole and the base of the tower. Nevertheless, in a brave last stand, Fabrizio del Carretto's knights held the line long enough for the city's cannons upon its walls to target and destroy the pontoon bridge. With the bridge's destruction, many Turkish soldiers were thrown into the water and drowned in their armour, while the soldiers on the mole were now left stranded. To complete the disaster, fire ships were unleashed on the Ottoman galleys, thus inflicting heavy casualties on the invaders. By the morning of the 19th, the northern attack had been repelled, and more than 2,500 Turkish bodies floated at the entrance of the harbour. After the failed assault, Messi Pasha focused all his attention on the southern land walls. For over a month, preparations were made to attack the towers of England, Provence and Italy, while the army resupplied and rested. Finally, on July 27th, the moat in front of the land walls was filled, and an assault was launched on the ruins of the Italian tower. The first wave of Beshi bazooka regulars broke through the breach, followed by a second wave of Janissaries. After some time, the defenders retreated from the damaged walls to their new defences in the Jewish quarter. However, as Ottoman troops pushed through the walls, they encountered a kill zone where they were hit with gunfire from the palisades and crossbow fire from the ruined towers of Italy and Provence to their rear. Although the former tower was briefly captured during a fierce fight, the defence in the Jewish quarter proved too strong for even the elite Janissaries to overcome. In the bloody melee, D'Aubusson gathered a group of knights and personally climbed the ruined Italian tower to recapture it, but not before suffering a spear wound to the chest. As Ottoman standards fell from the tower, the morale of the invaders was broken, marking another disastrous attempt to take the city. Seeing his chances to capture Rhodes fade away, Messi Pasha ended the siege on August 7th. The Ottoman Grand Admiral lost more than half of his forces during the siege, compared to only a few hundred Hospitallers. When Messi Pasha returned to Constantinople, he was stripped of all commands and titles from the Sultan and exiled to Gallipoli. The siege of Rhodes was a bloody defeat for Mehmed II, as his plans to dominate the Aegean Sea were dashed. Even before the siege of Rhodes, Sultan Mehmed II had begun preparing for his main military campaign planned for the summer of 1480. After the fall of Albania in 1478 and the Despotate of Epirus in 1479, the gateway to Italy had been opened for Ottoman forces to invade. Since his infamous conquest of Constantinople nearly 30 years earlier, Mehmed II had looked westward, toward the ancient lands of Italy. After decades of brutal wars across the Balkans, Anatolia and the Mediterranean, the expansive Ottoman armies and navies were now ready to take the eternal city of Rome, and it seemed that Islam's final victory over Christianity was just over the horizon. With Venice promising not to intervene in the upcoming war, the Adriatic Sea was open for crossing, making Italy ripe for the taking. By the summer of 1480, the newly appointed governor of Lori, Gedik Ahmed Pasha, prepared for the upcoming campaign, assembling a force of 18,000 soldiers and 140 ships. The first phase of the invasion involved capturing the region of Apulia, specifically the coastal towns of Brindisi, Taranto and Otranto. From there, it was expected that the army would be reinforced with fresh levies from the Balkans, and march either on the Neapolitan capital of Naples, or possibly even march to Rome itself. The original plan was to land in Brindisi. However, after learning from a merchant ship captured while en route from Otranto to Durrës that there were almost no coastal defences further south, Ahmed Pasha decided to make his main landing near Otranto. On the morning of Friday, July 28th, a squadron of cavalry landed secretly near the castle of Rocca. It quickly moved through the countryside towards Otranto, capturing many residents and cattle. The first skirmish of the campaign occurred when the garrisons of Otranto sallied out and defeated a small Turkish force near the lakes of Elimini, freeing many prisoners in the process. However, as more Ottoman troops began landing all along the coast, the garrison was pushed back behind the town's walls. With terms of surrender rejected by the garrison, the official siege of Otranto commenced. For 15 long days, Turkish cannons bombarded the coastal town. Poorly defended and morale broken from the constant bombardment, the town's garrison could not resist the Ottoman war machine for much longer. On August 11th, Ahmed Pasha ordered an assault on the land walls, and after a short struggle, Otranto fell to the invaders. Otranto was the first mainland territory in Italy to be occupied by a Muslim power since the Emirate of Taranto was overthrown by the Eastern Romans in 880. In the days after the fall, the town was sacked by the Turkish army, which saw thousands of its inhabitants killed and enslaved. With the sudden fall of Otranto, Ottoman raiders now pillaged their way through the Italian countryside, reaching the gates of Lecce and Brindisi to the north and Taranto to the west. The port settlement of Vieste was also assaulted by Ottoman ships by the end of August, but was eventually repelled by the town's more prepared garrison. However, just as the conquest of Apulia was about to begin, Ahmed Pasha returned to Albania with the bulk of his army to winter, as the campaigning season for the year had come to an end. Seen as a gateway into Italy, Otranto was left with a token garrison of 6,500 led by Hayreddin Mustafa Bey, the island governor of Negroponte. It was envisioned that a future campaign further into Italy would be launched the following year. While Ottoman armies fought in Rhodes and Otranto, Turkish raiders in the Balkans once again penetrated deep into Europe. While Frederick III and Matthias Corvinus were waging war in Austria, the regions of Carniola, Carinthia and Styria were ravaged. Loot was taken from the land, villages were burned, and many peasants were enslaved. The raiders were seen as far north as Rottenmann in central Austria and as far west as Arnoldstein near the Venetian border. It was during this heightened chaos in the wider region that the Republic of Ragusa, a vassal of the Sultan, officially agreed to increase its tribute to the Sublime Porte to 15,000 ducats a year. In return, the Ottoman Sultan guaranteed military protection for Ragusa and granted the Republic extensive trading privileges in the Aegean and Black Seas. As the Balkans were in turmoil and Turkish troops were now stationed in Italy, Pope Sixtus IV called for a crusade against Mehmed. In a rare display of European cooperation against Ottoman aggression, a military alliance was formed among the papacy, Naples, Genoa, Ferrara, Siena, Bologna, Lucca, Mantua, Montferrat, and Hungary in the spring of 1481, with an army and a fleet assembled to retake Otranto. King Ferdinand I of Naples appointed his son, Duke Alfonso of Calabria, to lead the Allied forces and siege the town on May 1st. However, as the siege started, shocking news from the east arrived, surprising both the attackers and defenders. During the harsh winter of 1480 to 1481, Sultan Mehmed II's health deteriorated significantly while he resided in his new palace in Constantinople. For over 20 years, the Sultan had suffered from gout. However, with the arrival of spring, his condition improved, and he began planning new military campaigns against either the Mamluks, the Knights Hospitaller, or Italy. On April 25th, the Sultan travelled to Hunkaciere, about 50 miles from Constantinople, to inspect his forces. But just 5 days into his inspection, Mehmed fell ill again with another gout attack and developed several new ailments, shocking his chief physician. The court's second doctor, an Italian Jewish convert named Yakub Pasha, also administered medicine to the Sultan. Still, according to some Ottoman sources, he had slowly poisoned Mehmed in the weeks before his departure from the capital. Regardless of the circumstances, Sultan Mehmed II died in his tent on May 3, 1481, while gathering his armies. He was 49 years old. The Sultan, who reigned over the empire for over 32 years, over the course of 2 separate reigns, had been the most energetic and determined ruler in his state's history. During his long tenure in power, the Ottoman state had been transformed from being a decentralized feudal sultanate into a highly centralized bureaucratic empire. The old Turkic Ghazi nobility, which had dominated affairs within the Sublime Porte, had been entirely sidelined in favor of a new class of Balkan elite comprising Devshirme converts, all part of the Sultan's Kul system. This system was a form of political servitude that empowered the central government to appoint men who owed their wealth and social status to the Sultan, rather than men from aristocratic families with substantial private wealth. After the 1450s, such men were appointed to high offices within the central bureaucracy, the palace, the provincial administration, and the military. All of these developments came at the expense of the Turkic marcher lords of old, who had first expanded Ottoman power into the Balkans a century earlier. Over time, Turkish aristocratic families in Anatolia also had their hereditary lands transformed into state-owned timars, in which the Sultan could direct his power over them. By replacing the remnants of the old Turkic elite, the gates were opened to the Devshirme class to wield absolute power within the empire in the future. Mehmed also took the first steps to centralize the empire's coinage by establishing a central mint in the capital called the Defana, which replaced local mints in the provinces. With the Sublime Porte now able to regulate its own currency, it gave the state the power to reduce its dependence on foreign currency and directly oversee its production. The Sultan also initiated the process of centralizing law within the empire through the gradual development of a new codified Ottoman law code known as the Kanunnama, which his great-grandson, Suleiman the Magnificent, later completed in the 16th century. Additional centralization occurred through the millet system, which allowed Christians and Jews some local autonomy under their religious leaders, who in turn paid allegiance to the central government. Like his father, the Sultan had also been a hefty spender, as he was a patron of the arts and learning. During his reign, he brought many scholars, architects, and artists from across the Islamic world and Europe to strengthen not only his new capital, but also to satisfy his quest for knowledge. Culturally and intellectually, Mehmed II was unusually open to Renaissance ideas for a Muslim ruler of his time. Fascinated by classical antiquity, he collected Greek and Roman manuscripts, commissioned translations, and modeled himself after conquerors like Alexander the Great. His court attracted Italian artists, most notably Gentile Bellini, who painted his portrait in the Renaissance style. Mehmed's curiosity also extended to philosophy, geography, and science, and he sought conversations with European humanists. While staying firmly rooted in Islamic traditions, he absorbed parts of Renaissance humanism, blending them into his imperial image. However, the majority of the money spent by the Sultan during his reign was for military purposes. Between 1451 and 1481, Ottoman armies and fleets were engaged in numerous military campaigns, which significantly drained the state's fiscal and human resources. During these 30 years, only 3 years were spent in relative peace. However, even during these breaks, Mehmed continuously planned new conquests to expand his empire. As a result, the Sultan was seen as a heavy spender and an unpopular figure among many in Ottoman society. The military was exhausted and stretched to its physical limits. Ordinary citizens of the empire were overtaxed and forced to live in a constant wartime economy, while many in the bureaucracy feared the Sultan's authoritarian tendencies in controlling all aspects of government. In sum, Mehmed II's legacy is one of synthesis. He combined military might with cultural curiosity, Islamic governance with Renaissance influence, and ruthless ambition with pragmatic statecraft. His reign not only reshaped the Ottoman